Four men in tactical gear dragged a fifth through the emergency entrance, his chest armor torn open, his body going limp between their hands. The trauma bay erupted. Monitors screamed. Physicians shouted orders across each other. And in the middle of it all, on her knees beside a yellow mop bucket, scrubbing dried coffee off the linoleum like she had every Tuesday for the past 11 weeks, was a blonde woman in a standard-issue nursing uniform who didn't look up. Not until the tallest operator stopped walking. Not until he stared at her, really stared, and said barely above a whisper, "Major?" Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now. This channel is home to stories that will stop you mid-breath, and you do not want to miss what's coming next. Drop a like, and tell me in the comments, what city and country are you watching from? I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The shift started the way every shift at Carver Peak Medical Center started, with Linda Mercer standing at the nursing station with a clipboard, reading names off a list like she was announcing chores at a summer camp. Bennett. She didn't look up. Supply closet needs a full inventory after rounds. Housekeeping called out again. Floor 3 scrubbing goes to you. Nora Bennett took the assignment without comment. She picked up her supply kit, tucked it under her arm, and walked down the hall without once looking back at the group of nurses trading glances behind her. She had learned, somewhere in the first 2 weeks at this hospital, that reacting was expensive. You spent energy. You got labeled. You handed people ammunition they could use the next time they wanted you gone. So she didn't react. She worked. Carver Peak sat on the western edge of Harlan, Montana, a mid-sized regional hospital trying to behave like a research institution, with the budget of neither and the politics of both. It served a population stretched thin across a mountain corridor, had one of the highest trauma admission rates in the state, and employed a rotating cast of surgical residents who cycled through on 12-month contracts from a partnered university program in Billings. One of those residents was Dr. Ethan Graves. Graves was tall, confident in the way that men who had never been seriously wrong tend to be confident, and he had decided somewhere in his first week that Nora Bennett was furniture. She was background. She was the kind of woman who handed you things and stayed out of your way while you did the real work. He had communicated this through small, consistent degradations. He called her the floor nurse instead of by name, even when they were in the same room. He redirected patient questions away from her mid-sentence. When she flagged an abnormal potassium result on a post-cardiac patient last month and asked him to review it, he had glanced at the chart for 4 seconds and said, "I think I went to medical school, thanks," and walked away. The patient had gone into arrhythmia 6 hours later. A different physician caught it. No one connected the timeline. No one asked Nora what she had seen. She had documented it anyway. She documented everything. That was something she had learned to do before Carver Peak. Before Montana. Before any of this. She had learned it in places where documentation was the difference between an investigation and a burial. By 9:15, she was on the 3rd floor with the mop cart, working her way down the corridor outside the surgical waiting room. The morning light came flat through the windows. A family sat in the corner, a teenage girl asleep against a man who was almost certainly her father, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the middle distance. Nora moved the cart quietly around the corner so the sound wouldn't carry. She had almost made it to the supply room when her radio crackled. All available nurses, Trauma Bay 1, mass casualty incoming, military transport, ETA 4 minutes. She stopped. The mop dripped once onto the floor. She stood there for a moment, not frozen exactly, but recalculating. The pull she felt was so automatic it almost embarrassed her. Something in her chest recognized the words military transport, the way a hand recognizes a burn before the brain finishes processing the pain. She turned the cart around and went downstairs. She arrived at Trauma Bay 1 to find it already organized into the standard configuration. Crash cart staged, surgical tray prepped, 2 nurses from the ER team pulling on gloves. The attending physician that morning was Dr. Ansel Pruitt, a 50-something internist who had lateral coverage over trauma on Tuesdays because the trauma attending was at a conference in Denver. Pruitt was competent in his lane. Trauma was not his lane. Graves was there too, positioning himself near the head of the bed with the particular posture of someone who had decided this was his scene before the patient arrived. The transport came in hard. 4 men in tactical gear, 1 on the gurney. The patient was male, mid-30s, with penetrating chest trauma and a pressure bandage that had been applied with the kind of precision that only came from people who had done it before, under conditions that didn't allow for second attempts. His color was wrong, a gray-blue around the lips that had nothing to do with the overhead lighting. His breathing was short, labored, and asymmetric. Nora stepped forward without thinking. "What's his presentation?" she asked the lead operator, a tall man with a cut above his left eye and field dust still on his jacket. He looked at her for exactly 1 second, then he answered. "Penetrating right chest, probable pneumo, BP was 78 systolic in the vehicle, OSAT was 86 on 15 liters. He's been declining for the last 8 minutes. How long since impact?" 31 minutes. She processed that without showing it. Graves stepped in front of her. "I'll take the history." He addressed the operator like Nora wasn't standing there. "What happened?" The operator looked at Graves, then back at Nora. Something moved across his face, a hesitation. But he repeated the information, this time to Graves. Nora moved to the right side of the gurney and looked at the patient's chest. The right side wasn't moving the same way the left was. The trachea, she checked it against the midline, was deviating slightly. Not dramatically, but she had seen this before, in conditions where dramatic came after, and it came fast. "He needs a needle decompression," she said. "His trachea is shifting. This isn't a simple pneumothorax." Graves didn't turn around. "Bag him and get me 2 large-bore IVs." "Dr. Graves," her voice was level. "Look at the tracheal deviation." He turned then, but not to look at the patient. He looked at her. "Bennett, what exactly is your assigned role in this bay right now?" "I'm telling you what I'm seeing." "What you're seeing?" He almost smiled. "You were mopping the floor 40 minutes ago. Step back." Dr. Pruitt looked between them. He was already outside his comfort zone. She could see it in the way he was standing, weight shifted back, hands not yet committed. He wanted someone to be right. He just wasn't sure who. "The trachea," Nora said again, directing it at Pruitt this time. "Right side tension. If we don't decompress him, security." Graves raised his voice toward the door. "Can someone get her out of here?" She didn't go easily. That was the honest truth of it. She was escorted to the hallway by a security officer named Ray, who had the decency to look uncomfortable about it. She stood at the glass window and watched the trauma bay through it, her hands at her sides, her face doing nothing useful. The patient's OSAT was visible on the monitor from where she stood. 81, 79. The numbers moved downward with a patience that felt obscene. She watched Graves call for a chest X-ray. She watched the technician position the portable unit. She watched the clock. A chest X-ray took time to acquire, time to transmit, time to read. If she was right about the tension pneumothorax, and she was, she knew she was the way she knew certain things that lived below language. That time was going to matter in a way that couldn't be undone afterward. Ray was still standing beside her. He wasn't touching her. He was just there, the way security guards are, occupying space. "You should move away from the window," he said, not unkindly. "Not yet," she said. 76 on the monitor. She thought about a place in the Kandahar province, 2011, the inside of an overturned vehicle, a soldier whose name she had said out loud to herself every day for 3 months afterward. She thought about the moment between knowing and doing, and how short that window actually was when you stripped everything else away. 73. She turned to Ray. "Call the charge nurse. Tell her to get someone back in that bay." "Ma'am, I know you have a job to do. I'm asking you to do it better than you think you can." He stared at her. She held his gaze without any aggression in it. Just weight. The kind of weight that accumulates over years of being the person in the room who knows the thing no one wants to hear. Ray reached for his radio. She turned back to the window. 71. The team inside was still waiting for the X-ray image to load on the portable screen. Graves was at the head of the bed, talking. Pruitt was checking the IV line. Neither of them was looking at the monitor. Nora pushed the door open. There was a moment. She would replay it later, in the quiet of her apartment, in the small hours when sleep stayed out of reach, where she walked back into that trauma bay and every head turned toward her, and she understood that this was the kind of moment that didn't have a neutral outcome. She was either going to be right, or she was going to spend the next several months defending a decision that had already been made in the worst possible way. She walked to the right side of the gurney, identified the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, and reached for the 14-gauge needle on the prep tray. "Bennett." Graves's voice was flat with a cold she hadn't heard from him before. "Put that down." His SAT is 68. She had already located the landmark. "I'm decompressing him." "Do not—" She inserted the needle. The rush of air was audible. The monitor shifted immediately. 68, 72, 77, climbing with the particular urgency of a body that had been given back something it desperately needed. The patient's chest movement equalized. The trachea, visible at the sternal notch, moved back toward center. The room was so quiet she could hear the ventilation system. Then the patient moved. He had been unconscious on arrival, or close enough to it, but something returned in the 30 seconds after decompression, some layer of awareness that the body reasserts when the immediate threat is reversed. He turned his head slightly. His eyes found her face. His right arm lifted from the gurney, slowly, deliberately. The movement cost him something. She could see it in the tension around his jaw. But he completed it. A formal military salute. She stood there with blood on her glove and said nothing. The lead operator stepped forward from the corner of the room where the team had been standing in enforced silence. He was not a small man. He moved like someone who had spent a long time operating in spaces where the wrong movement had consequences. And he came to stand directly beside the gurney and looked at Nora with an expression she recognized before she could name it. "The rest of you can stand down," he said, not to the medical team, but to his own men. Then he looked back at Nora. "Good to see you again, Major Bennett." The name landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Graves went still. Pruitt turned slowly from the crash cart. A second operator, younger than the others, with a jaw still carrying tension from whatever they had come from, said quietly, "She trained half our medics at Bragg." The lead operator nodded once. "She trained mine." That's Linda Mercer arrived 7 minutes later, which was how long it took for someone to get a message to her office, and for her to walk the length of the building with the particular speed of a person who had heard something alarming and was deciding on her position before she arrived. She came through the trauma bay door with her clipboard at her chest like a shield, and looked at the tableau in front of her. The operators, the stabilized patient, Graves standing at the periphery of his own trauma bay, Nora at the bedside, and said, "What happened here?" Nobody answered for a moment. Then Graves said, "She interfered with an active resuscitation." "He was dying," said the lead operator. His voice didn't rise. He was a man who understood that volume was often the least effective tool available. "She saved his life. She was not assigned. I don't care what she was assigned." He turned to look at Graves with the kind of measured attention that people who have been in dangerous rooms learn to deploy. "I care that my man is alive." Mercer's eyes moved to Nora. There was something in them that Nora had seen before. A recalibration happening in real time. A woman who had categorized someone and was now finding that the category didn't hold. "Nora," she said, and it was the first time in 11 weeks she had used her first name, "you should go write up your assessment while it's fresh." It was a way of removing her from the room that sounded like consideration. Nora recognized it for what it was. She pulled off her glove, dropped it in the biohazard bin, and walked to the door. She stopped at the threshold. "The monitor logs," she said, not turning around. "Someone should save those before they roll over. The timestamps will matter." Then she walked out. Commander Grant Hale arrived 40 minutes later. He was not in uniform, field jacket, civilian pants, but he carried the authority of rank the way certain people carry it, as a climate rather than a costume. He went directly to the nursing station and asked for the charge nurse, who directed him to Nora's documentation room, where she was sitting at a terminal entering her clinical notes with the focused, unhurried precision of someone who understood that words written down were the only ones that survived intact. Hale closed the door behind him. She looked up. "Sir," she said, "you don't have to call me that here." Old habit. He sat down across from her, uninvited, in the way of people who have known each other long enough to dispense with those formalities. He looked at her for a moment, and she let him because she knew what he was doing. He was reading her the way people trained to assess situations read them, cataloging what had changed and what hadn't. "You saved Kowalski," he said. "I did my job." "You're a floor nurse at a regional hospital in Montana." "That's correct." "You were mopping the hallway when we came in." Apparently the janitor called out. Hale leaned forward with his forearms on his knees. Nora, talk to me. She set down her pen. There's nothing to talk about. I made a clinical decision. It was the right one. It's documented. Cole is talking about filing a complaint. Graves, she corrected. He blinked. What? His name is Graves. Dr. Ethan Graves. She picked up her pen again, and I'd expect nothing less. Hale was quiet for a moment. Outside the door, she could hear the hospital moving, feet in the corridor, the distant double tone of an elevator, someone asking for a chart. Why are you here? He said finally. Here specifically, this hospital. She looked at him. I needed a job. There are hospitals in cities where people know who you are. I know. This doesn't make sense, Nora. It made sense to me. She turned back to the terminal. And I'd appreciate it if whatever conversation you feel needs to happen between the military and this hospital's administration happens in a way that doesn't turn my clinical decision into a referendum on my service record. He watched her type for a moment. Then he stood. Kowalski's going to want to thank you. He already did, she said. I got the message. Hale moved to the door and stopped. He didn't turn around. You know they're going to come after you for this. I know. And? She saved her document. And I have very complete notes. The complaint landed on the chief medical officer's desk by 3 o'clock. Dr. Ethan Graves had submitted a formal statement alleging that Nora Bennett had unlawfully intervened in an active trauma resuscitation without physician authorization, had disregarded a direct order to leave the treatment area, had performed an invasive procedure outside her documented scope of practice, and had, in his clinical judgment, endangered the patient. Nora read the copy that appeared in her personnel file. She found out about it from Derek Lawson, a male nurse who had been at Carver Peak for 3 years and who brought her the printout with the particular expression of someone delivering bad news to a person they suspected could handle it. They're calling it reckless endangerment of a patient, he said, of a patient who would be dead without the intervention. I know. The monitor logs will show the oxygen saturation timeline, if the logs are still accessible. She looked at him. What do you mean? Derek put the printout on the table. Someone flagged the trauma bay system for a routine IT audit this afternoon. Everything from that bay is in read-only lockdown while the audit runs. She sat with that for a moment. Who ordered the audit? The request came from administration, Mercer's office. The room was quiet. Nora looked at the complaint in her hand. Graves' signature at the bottom. The timestamp, 2:47 p.m. The IT audit request had gone in at 2:52, 5 minutes. They're moving fast, Derek said. Yes, she said. They are. She set the complaint down. She picked up her pen. She began to write. Not a rebuttal. Not a grievance. A timeline. Every intervention, every timestamp, every witness present in that room. Every word she remembered being said and by whom. She wrote it the way she had learned to write things in environments where the record was the only thing that lasted, where the person with the most accurate account of events was the person who survived the inquiry that followed. She wrote for 40 minutes without stopping. When she finished, she printed 2 copies, sealed them in separate envelopes, and gave one to Derek. Hold on to that, she said. Don't tell anyone you have it. He looked at the envelope, then at her. What's in it? Insurance, she said. For both of us. Derek tucked it into his jacket pocket without another word. She picked up her own copy, slid it into her bag, and walked back out to the floor to finish her shift, because her shift wasn't over, and the patients on floor 3 still needed their evening assessments, and whatever happened next was going to happen regardless of whether she was standing in a documentation room worrying about it or doing the work she had come here to do. She passed the trauma bay on the way to the elevator. Through the window, she could see Kowalski, stable now, color returning, the kind of post-crisis quiet that came after the body's emergency system stood down. One of his teammates was seated beside the bed. The man's posture was relaxed in a way that soldiers only managed when the immediate threat was resolved. He looked up as she passed. He nodded once. She nodded back. Then she kept walking. She was finishing her last chart of the evening when she received the notification on her hospital portal. A formal investigative review had been opened into the events of Trauma Bay 1, scheduled to begin at 8 a.m. the following morning. Nora Bennett was required to surrender her Trauma Bay access badge by end of shift and was placed on restricted duty pending the outcome. Restricted duty, no Trauma Bay access, no acute resuscitation cases, no procedures without attending physician co-signature. The notification was signed by Linda Mercer. Nora read it twice. Then she logged off the terminal, collected her badge, and walked to the security desk to surrender it. The guard, a different one from Ray, took it without comment and placed it in a labeled envelope. She thanked him. She collected her bag from her locker. She walked out through the main entrance into the Montana evening, where the light was doing what it did at this hour in this part of the country, going gold and long across the parking lot, throwing the kind of shadows that made ordinary things look larger than they were. She stopped at her car. She took a breath. Somewhere across the lot, she heard a vehicle door open. She turned. Commander Hale was leaning against a dark SUV parked 2 rows over. He had his arms crossed and the look of a man who had been waiting and didn't mind that she'd seen him do it. "They suspended your access," he said. "Word travels." "We have people inside." He paused. "Nora, I pulled your service record today. The full file." She looked at him. "I know why you left," he said. "I know what happened in 2019. The parking lot was very quiet. That investigation closed," she said. "I was cleared." "I know you were cleared. That's not what I'm talking about." He pushed off from the vehicle. "I'm talking about the fact that you were cleared and you still ended up here, mopping floors and letting a second-rate surgical resident talk to you like you're invisible." She didn't answer. "The records are going to come out, Nora. When this investigation opens tomorrow, they're going to pull your background. All of it." "I know. And when they see what you actually are, then they'll know." She opened her car door. "And it won't change what I did or what he failed to do." "Nora, good night, Commander." She got in the car. She sat there for a moment after the door closed, in the silence of a vehicle that held no one but her, and she looked through the windshield at the hospital building, at the lit windows and the ambient glow of a place that ran all night regardless of what happened inside it. She thought about the monitor logs, about the 5-minute gap between the complaint and the IT lockdown, about 11 weeks of mop buckets and inventory lists and being talked around in rooms she should have been running. She thought about a formal complaint filed against a woman who had just prevented a man from dying. She thought about the envelope Derek was carrying in his jacket pocket, and the copy in her own bag, and the things she had witnessed and written down with the care of someone who had learned, in environments that didn't forgive carelessness, that the account which survives is the one that was written first. Then she started the engine and drove home. Behind her, through the glass doors of Carver Peak Medical Center, Dr. Ethan Graves was standing at the nursing station, watching her taillights disappear and telling Linda Mercer that by tomorrow morning this would all be over. He had no idea what was in that envelope. He had no idea what Nora Bennett had spent 11 weeks quietly, carefully, and completely watching him do. And he had no idea, not yet, that the woman he had tried to have removed from a trauma bay for saving a man's life had a service record that, when it was finally read in full, was going to make every person in that hospital understand exactly who they had handed a mop. He had no idea what was coming, but Nora Bennett did. And that, in the end, was the only advantage that had ever mattered. She didn't sleep well. That wasn't new. She hadn't slept well in years, not since a stretch of nights in 2019 that had rewired something fundamental in the way her body understood rest. She lay in the dark of her apartment above the hardware store on Clement Street and listened to the building settle and thought about timestamps. The complaint had been filed at 2:47 p.m. The IT lockdown request had gone in at 2:52, 5 minutes. That was the gap between Graves deciding to come after her and someone in administration moving to protect him. 5 minutes was fast enough that it hadn't been improvised. Someone had known the complaint was coming before it was filed. Someone had been ready. She got up at 4:30, made coffee, and sat at her kitchen table with a legal pad. She wrote down everything she knew about the trauma bay system at Carver Peak, not from the clinical side, but from the infrastructure side. She had spent 3 weeks on the IT onboarding rotation when she first arrived, because Mercer had assigned her there as a way of keeping her occupied while the nursing schedule was being finalized. She had learned more about the hospital's data architecture in those 3 weeks than most nurses learned in a decade at the same institution. because Nora Bennett had a particular habit of paying attention to things that other people considered beneath their notice. The trauma bay monitors were networked through a central server that backed up on a rolling 48-hour cycle. The backup wasn't stored locally. It pushed to an off-site server maintained by the hospital's contracted IT vendor, a company called Meridian Health Systems based out of Billings. The backup ran automatically at 11 p.m. and 11 a.m., regardless of any local lockdown, which meant that if the data existed on the off-site server before the lockdown was initiated at 2:52 p.m. yesterday, the lockdown couldn't touch it. The 11 a.m. backup had run at 11:04 a.m., 3 hours and 47 minutes before the complaint was filed. She circled that number on the legal pad. Then she looked at her phone. She had Derek Lawson's number. She also had the number of a woman named Maya Reyes, who had worked at Carver Peak for 16 months before being quietly transitioned out of her position 8 months ago. Maya had reached out to Nora in her second week on the floor, briefly, carefully, in the way of someone who wanted to say something but needed to be sure of the person they were saying it to. Nora hadn't pushed. She had listened, given Maya her number, and waited. Maya had texted her 4 times since then, twice to ask how things were going. Once to say she was still around if Nora ever needed anything. Once, 3 weeks ago, to say, "There are things here you should probably know about, when you're ready." Nora looked at the clock. 4:47 a.m. She texted Maya anyway. "I'm ready." The 8 a.m. review meeting convened in the hospital's administrative conference room on the 4th floor, and Nora arrived exactly on time, which was a deliberate choice. She had spent enough time in institutional proceedings to know that arriving early looked nervous and arriving late looked hostile. On time was neutral. On time said, "I have nothing to manage here." The room held 6 people. Linda Mercer, sitting at the far end with her clipboard. Dr. Ansel Pruitt, looking like a man who had not slept and was deeply unhappy about being present. A hospital attorney named Carl Voss, 50s, sport coat, the expression of someone performing careful neutrality. A nursing board representative, a woman Nora didn't recognize. And Dr. Ethan Graves, seated to the left of the attorney with his hands folded on the table in a posture that was trying to project composure and mostly projecting the effort it took to maintain it. The chair of the review was a man named Dr. Robert Kellum, chief medical officer of Carver Peak, who had the look of someone who had been doing administrative medicine long enough that very little genuinely surprised him anymore. He was in his early 60s. He had read Nora's personnel file before she walked in. She could tell because he looked at her with the specific attention of someone reconciling a person with a document. "Ms. Bennett," he said, "thank you for coming." "Dr. Kellum." She sat down. The review opened with Voss reading the formal complaint into the record. All 4 allegations, in the language that Graves had used, which was precise enough to suggest he had either written it with legal assistance or had done this before. Nora listened without expression. When Voss finished, Kellum looked at her. "Would you like to respond to the allegations as stated?" "Yes," she said. "I'd like to start with the monitor data." Graves shifted in his seat. "The trauma bay monitors are networked to an off-site backup through Meridian Health Systems," Nora said. "The backup ran at 11 a.m. yesterday, 3 hours and 47 minutes before the complaint was filed, and approximately 4 hours before the IT lockdown was initiated. The backup data is not affected by the lockdown. The oxygen saturation readings from the point of patient admission through my intervention are preserved on the Meridian server and are retrievable by your IT department with a written request." The nursing board representative looked up from her notes. Carl Voss was very still. "The data," Nora continued, "will show that the patient's oxygen saturation dropped from 86% on admission to 68% over a period of approximately 9 minutes without a decompression intervention being initiated. It will show the precise moment the saturation began recovering, which corresponds to the decompression I performed. It will also show that Dr. Graves was the physician of record during the 9-minute decline." She let that sit for 3 seconds. "The decompression was not reckless," she said. "It was 9 minutes overdue." The room was quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when something has been said that changes the shape of everything that came after it. Graves leaned toward the attorney and said something in a low voice. Voss touched his sleeve. A small, controlled gesture that meant, "Don't." Kellum looked at Pruitt. "Dr. Pruitt, you were the attending of record. Pruitt's jaw moved before his voice did. Yes, I was the attending. What did you observe regarding the patient's respiratory status prior to Ms. Bennett's intervention? Pruitt looked at the table. There was concern about the presentation. Whose concern? Another pause. Ms. Bennett raised it, twice. Graves looked at Pruitt with an expression that was trying to be neutral and had completely failed. Twice, Kellum repeated, and the decompression was performed because the patient's saturation was declining and Ms. Bennett assessed tension pneumothorax and acted on it. Pruitt said it like a man pulling off a bandage. And she was right. The meeting broke for a 90-minute recess at 10:15 to allow the administrative team to formally request the Meridian data. Nora went to the fourth-floor waiting area, got a cup of coffee from the machine that had been broken for 6 weeks and had apparently been fixed at some point without announcement, and sat in a chair by the window. Derek found her there at 10:30. He sat down beside her without preamble. Words moving fast. It usually does. Graves told 2 of the residents this morning that you falsified your nursing credentials. Derek's voice was flat. He's saying you weren't qualified to perform the procedure. Nora took a sip of coffee. What are my listed credentials? RN, BSN, certified trauma nurse. No procedural certifications beyond standard scope. Right. She looked at the window. That's accurate. So he's not wrong. He's not wrong about what the paperwork says. She set the cup down. He's wrong about what the paperwork shows. Derek looked at her. What does it show? What it's always shown. She stood. That I'm a nurse. He caught her arm, gently, not to stop her. Nora, whatever's in your background, whatever Hale was talking about last night, it's going to come out in there. I know. Are you ready for that? She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. She had spent 3 years deliberately building a life around a version of herself that was smaller and quieter than what she actually was, not as a disguise exactly, but as a kind of penance, a self-imposed reduction. She had told herself it was about avoiding risk, about not trusting her own judgment after 2019, but standing here in a hospital corridor with a formal complaint against her name and a patient who was alive because she had acted anyway, she could see that the reduction hadn't protected anyone. It had just made more room for people like Graves. Ask me after, she said, and walked back to the conference room. The Meridian data arrived at 11:47 a.m. It was exactly what she had said it would be. The IT administrator presented it on a laptop at the conference room table. A clean readout of the trauma bay monitor data, time-stamped from patient admission at 9:23 a.m. through 11:00 a.m. when the backup captured it. The saturation readings were there. The 9-minute decline was there. The recovery curve beginning at 10:02:14 a.m., the moment of decompression, was there in unambiguous color-coded graph form. Kellum looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Graves. Graves was looking at the laptop screen with the expression of a man watching something he had assumed was manageable becoming something else entirely. Dr. Graves, Kellum said, the patient's oxygen saturation reached 68% before the intervention. Can you explain the delay in initiating decompression? I was in the process of obtaining imaging to confirm. The tracheal deviation was observable on physical exam, Kellum said. Ms. Bennett raised it twice. Dr. Pruitt has confirmed this. She doesn't have procedural authorization. She is alive, said a voice from the doorway. Every head turned. Commander Grant Hale stood in the doorway in a way that suggested he had been there for at least part of the preceding conversation and had chosen this moment precisely. Beside him stood a woman Nora didn't immediately recognize, tall, early 40s, in civilian clothes that were a grade too precise to be casual, with the bearing of someone who wore rank as a permanent posture. That chair you're occupying, Hale said to Kellum, not unkindly, is going to have a different occupant by this time tomorrow if the outcome of this meeting doesn't reflect what that data actually shows. Voss, the attorney, straightened immediately. I'm going to need to understand who is Captain Rebecca Sloan, the woman said, and produced a credentials wallet. Naval Legal Service Office. We represent Petty Officer First Class Daniel Kowalski, who is currently recovering on your second floor, and who has asked to provide a formal statement regarding the events of yesterday morning. Voss looked at the credentials. He looked at Kellum. He looked at Graves. Graves was looking at the table. The statement, Sloan continued, moving to an open chair and sitting down without being invited to, is that Petty Officer Kowalski was conscious enough during the intervention to understand what was occurring. He is prepared to testify that he received a delayed response to a visibly deteriorating respiratory emergency, that a nurse identified the condition and communicated it to the physician of record on 2 separate occasions, and that said, physician refused to act on the information. She set a folder on the table. He is also prepared to testify that the nurse's intervention saved his life. Nobody spoke. Hale stepped fully into the room. I'm also going to note for the record that Ms. Bennett's service history, which you're about to discover if you haven't already, includes significant combat trauma experience at the operational level. Her clinical instincts are not the product of overreach. They're the product of a background this hospital's hiring process didn't ask enough questions to surface. Kellum looked at Nora. She met his gaze and said nothing. "What is your service background?" he asked, and the tone of it wasn't adversarial. It was the tone of a man who had figured out he didn't have the full picture and wanted it. U.S. Army, she said. 12 years. Combat medic, then trauma officer. I trained special operations medical teams in multiple theaters. I left the service in 2021. She paused. I did not misrepresent my credentials to this hospital. Everything on my nursing application is accurate. I hold a valid RN license and trauma certification. I didn't list my service record because it wasn't required and because I wanted to practice as a nurse, not as whatever the military made me into. The room absorbed that. Sloan looked at her with a recognition that had nothing to do with having met before. The procedure you performed, Kellum said. Needle decompression. You've done it before. 60-something times, she said. Give or take. I stopped counting after the 3rd deployment. The meeting concluded at 1:30 p.m. without a formal resolution, which was itself a kind of resolution. The complaint was not upheld, but neither was it officially withdrawn, because Carl Voss had advised Graves that a formal withdrawal would constitute an implicit admission. What happened instead was a recess pending administrative review, which meant the complaint existed in a suspended state while Kellum's office figured out what to do with the fact that they had nearly fired a decorated combat trauma veteran for saving a patient that their own surgical resident had been actively failing. Nora walked out of the conference room and into the hallway and stood there for a moment, alone, with the particular stillness that follows something sustained and difficult. Derek appeared at the end of the corridor. He read her face from 20 feet away. Still standing, he said. Still standing, she agreed. The Meridian data? I know. Graves is going to... I know, Derek. She looked at him. What time is Maya coming? He checked his phone. She said 3 o'clock. Side entrance, by the loading dock. Okay. Nora started walking. Don't tell anyone. Maya Reyes was 34 years old, with the kind of eyes that had seen enough to stop performing optimism. She had a canvas bag slung over one shoulder, and she was standing at the side entrance when Nora arrived, and she looked at Nora the way people look at someone they've been waiting to trust for a long time. I heard about the review, Maya said. Word moves fast. I have friends still on the floor. Maya glanced toward the loading dock, checking the space the way people do when they're accustomed to conversations they'd rather not be overheard having. Are you okay? I'm functional. What did you bring? Maya set the canvas bag on the railing and unzipped it. Inside were 12 manila folders, each one labeled in handwriting that was careful and small, the handwriting of someone who had been taking notes in conditions where the notes might need to be read quickly. She had organized them by date, going back 14 months. When I left, Maya said, I knew that what had been done to me wasn't isolated, but I didn't have standing to do anything from outside. I couldn't use patient records. I couldn't access the system. She touched the edge of the folders. But I had kept personal notes. Contemporaneous records. Things I wrote in real time at home the same night they happened. Nora looked at the folders. What's in them? A pattern. Maya's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. The particular tension of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and was finally setting it down. 14 months of Graves misreading presentations and nurses catching it. 14 months of those nurses being written up, transferred, or pushed out when they documented what they saw. She paused. I was the 6th. Nora picked up the top folder and opened it. The notes inside were meticulous: dates, times, patient room numbers, descriptions of clinical presentations, descriptions of Graves's assessments, descriptions of what the nurses had flagged and what had been done with those flags. Some had been dismissed. Some had been documented and then inexplicably removed from the official record. 2 described patients who had experienced adverse events within 24 hours of Graves overruling nursing assessments. She turned a page. Then another. The altered records, she said. Who altered them? Graves initiated it. Mercer covered it. Maya's jaw tightened. There's a log in there, folder 9, where I mapped the discrepancies between what was entered in the system and what I had written down in real time. 3 cases where the nursing notes were modified after the fact. Not deleted, modified. Changed to reflect Graves's assessment rather than the original nursing observation. Nora looked up. You can prove this? I can prove what I witnessed in real time and documented that same night. Whether it proves what I think it proves, Maya paused. That's going to depend on whether anyone actually looks. Someone is going to look, Nora said. Captain Sloan is going to look. Maya blinked. Military legal? The patient from yesterday was a SEAL. His legal officer is already in the building. Nora closed the folder and looked at Maya directly. I need you to be willing to talk to her. Maya was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, processing. Nora could see the calculation happening, the weighing of what it would cost against what it would mean if she stayed quiet. They pushed me out, Maya said finally. They wrote my termination to look like a performance issue. I couldn't get a reference. I've been working 40 minutes outside the city for 8 months at a clinic that doesn't even have an ICU because no one here would hire me back. I know. And you want me to walk back in there and hand those folders to a military lawyer. I want you to do whatever you're capable of doing, Nora said. I'm not going to tell you it's easy. I'm not going to tell you it's without risk. But I can tell you that what's in these folders, if it says what you think it says, means that Graves didn't just come after me. He's been doing this for over a year. And if we stop now, he keeps doing it. Maya looked at the bag of folders. Then she looked at Nora. You're different than I expected, Maya said. People usually say that. You don't seem angry. Nora considered that. I'm very angry, she said. I'm just not interested in being loud about it. Captain Sloan met with them in a hospital conference room at 4 o'clock, and the meeting lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Nora sat in the corner and let Maya talk, because the folders were Maya's story to tell, and the testimony was Maya's to give. And because Nora had learned a long time ago that the instinct to take over situations you didn't need to take over was one of the most expensive habits a person could have. Sloan asked precise, unrushed questions. She moved through the folders methodically, flagging pages with sticky tabs, occasionally asking Maya to clarify a timeline or confirm a name. She didn't perform shock or outrage. She was the kind of lawyer who was most useful when she was quiet, and she was very quiet for most of that meeting. At 6:15, she looked up from folder 9. The record modification logs, she said. You have the original entries and the altered versions. Side by side, Maya confirmed. I photographed the original entries on my personal phone the same day I wrote the contemporaneous notes. I knew when I was doing it that I might need them. And why did you keep them instead of reporting immediately? Maya's hands were flat on the table. Because I had watched 5 nurses before me try to report. 2 went to HR. 1 went to the state nursing board. 2 resigned. None of them got anywhere. She paused. I kept them because I thought maybe someday the right person would ask. Sloan looked at the folder for a moment. Then she looked at Nora. You've seen all of this? This afternoon, Nora said. And your assessment? My assessment is that if you give those folders to the right people, the investigation currently aimed at me is going to turn around and face a very different direction. Sloan nodded once, slowly, the nod of someone confirming a conclusion they had already reached. She closed folder 9 and stacked the folders in a neat column on the table beside her. I'm going to need originals and digital copies, she said. Both. I'm also going to need your formal statements from each of you. Written, signed, dated, describing the provenance of the documents and the circumstances under which they were created. Tonight? Maya asked. If you're willing. Maya looked at Nora. Nora nodded. Maya said, Okay, so. It was past 9 o'clock when Nora finally left the hospital that evening. The parking lot was mostly empty, The kind of empty that had a different quality than the mornings, settled rather than waiting. She walked to her car and sat in the driver's seat for a moment without starting the engine. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, which resolved when she opened it to a contact she had stored years ago and not deleted. Sergeant First Class Paul Whitmore, who had been in her second training rotation at Fort Bragg, and who now worked, as far as she knew, somewhere in the alphabet soup of DoD administration. The text was 6 words. Your 201 file is being requested. She stared at the message. A 201 file was a military personnel record, full service history. Commendations, assignments, evaluations, incidents, everything. Her service record, the one she had spent 3 years quietly folding away into the part of herself she wasn't using anymore, was being pulled. Someone in that hospital, or connected to that hospital, was about to read the full account of who she was and what she had done, and they hadn't asked her permission, which meant they weren't pulling it to help her. They were pulling it to find something they could use against her. She thought about 2019, about the formal review, about the decision she had made under fire, and the 3 months of internal proceedings that followed, and the final determination that had cleared her completely, and the way she had felt when she read the clearance, which was not relief but something more complicated. The particular guilt of a person who had been found not guilty but could not stop prosecuting herself. She thought about what was in that file, about what a motivated person could find if they were looking for a way to paint a former military trauma officer as dangerous, unstable, or reckless. And she understood that what they were actually going to find, if they looked carefully, was the opposite of that, because her record was clean, her performance reviews were exceptional, and the 2019 review had concluded without a single adverse finding. But she also knew that documents could be reframed, that context could be stripped, that a formal review proceeding, even one with a clean outcome, could be made to sound like almost anything in a summary provided to a civilian hospital board by someone with a reason to make it sound a certain way. She needed to get ahead of it. She called Hale. He picked up on the second ring. I was going to call you. My 201 is being requested. A pause. I know. We flagged it an hour ago. Who requested it? Another pause. Longer. The request came from a private entity, not a government office. We're trying to identify the intermediary, but it went through a contractor channel, which means someone paid to have it pulled, Nora said. Yes. Graves doesn't have those connections. No, Hale said. He doesn't. She thought about that, about the chain from Graves to Mercer to whoever was above Mercer, with enough reach to access a military contractor channel on less than 24 hours' notice. Who is Mercer connected to? Nora asked. We're working on it. Work faster, she said. Whatever's in that file, whoever pulls it is going to have it by morning. I know. And whatever they do with it, Nora. Hale's voice was steady. Your record is clean. My record is clean, she agreed, but 2019 is in there. The silence that followed was the silence of a man who understood what she meant without needing it, explained. We'll put a hold on the request, he said. Can you do that? I can make some calls, it'll slow it down. 24 hours, maybe 48. That might be enough, she said. For what? She looked through the windshield at the hospital building, at the lit windows, at Carver Peak Medical Center, which had spent 11 weeks treating her like something it tracked on its floor with a mop, and which was now scrambling to manage the fact that she hadn't broken the way it needed her to break. For the investigation to move fast enough, she said, that whoever is pulling that file doesn't need it anymore because the story has already changed. She started the engine. Behind her, in the hospital's administrative wing, a light was still on in Linda Mercer's office, and through the gap in the blinds, Mercer was on the phone with someone who was not her husband and not the hospital's attorney, speaking in a low, urgent tone about documents and timelines, and whether certain things could still be managed. On Mercer's desk, open to the last entry, was a ledger that she had kept locked in her personal filing cabinet for 14 months. A record not of patient care, but of something else entirely, something that had begun as a small accommodation for a surgical resident with a promising career and had grown, incrementally and then all at once, into something that no accommodation could cover anymore. She didn't know that Maya Reyes had once seen that ledger, briefly, through an office door left open by accident. She didn't know that Maya had remembered enough of what she'd seen to describe it, in careful and specific detail, to a Naval Legal Service office captain who was at this moment drafting a formal records preservation request to prevent exactly the kind of document from disappearing that Mercer was now trying to decide whether she could afford to destroy. And she didn't know, not yet, that by the time she made that decision, it was already too late to matter. The decision Mercer was weighing at 11 o'clock that night had already been overtaken by events she didn't know had occurred. That was the particular cruelty of being the last person in a room to understand the geometry of what was collapsing around them. You spent your energy managing things that had already stopped mattering while the things that actually mattered moved without you. Captain Sloan had filed the records preservation request at 9:47 p.m. It covered every clinical document, administrative communication, personnel file, incident report, and system log at Carver Peak Medical Center generated in the previous 18 months. The request carried the authority of an active naval legal proceeding, which meant that the hospital's contracted IT vendor, Meridian Health Systems, was legally obligated to freeze all relevant data the moment the request was received and confirmed. Meridian confirmed receipt at 10:02 p.m. Mercer didn't find out until the following morning when she arrived at her office at 7:30 and found a printed notification on her desk from the hospital's legal department informing her that a federal records preservation order was in effect and that any deletion, modification, or transfer of affected documents would constitute obstruction of a military legal proceeding. She stood in her office doorway and read it twice. Then she called Carl Voss. Voss didn't answer. He was already on the phone with someone else. But Nora arrived at the hospital at 7:45 with a coffee she had made at home because the machine in the fourth-floor waiting area, having been repaired for apparently one day, was broken again. She was on restricted duty, which meant she had no clinical assignments, which meant she had the particular strange freedom of a person who was present in an institution but not yet part of its operations, watching it function from a slight remove. She went to the second floor. Kowalski was awake. He was propped up in the bed with his left arm connected to 2 IV lines and a chest tube that would... And he was eating hospital eggs with the expression of a man who had survived enough bad situations to have perspective on bad food. His teammate, the younger one, who had been at the bedside the night before, was in the chair in the corner, asleep sitting up in the way that people trained to sleep in difficult positions manage. She knocked on the doorframe. Kowalski looked up. "Major," he said. "Still not," she said. "How's the chest?" "Hurts when I breathe." "That's going to continue for a while." "How long?" "Weeks, maybe longer, depending on how much scar tissue develops." She moved to the bedside and looked at his chart, not because she had authorization to review it, but because it was on the hook at the foot of the bed and habits died at their own pace. His overnight vitals were stable. The chest tube output was within normal range. "You're going to be fine." "I know." He put down the fork. "Are you?" She looked at him. "Working on it?" "Hale told me what's happening." "I figured." "For what it's worth..." He stopped. Tried again. "There were 6 guys in that transport. 3 of them have been through some version of what you did for me, in other places, other times. We know what that intervention looks like when someone does it right. We know what it looks like when someone does it who's done it before." "I appreciated the salute," she said. "I wasn't expecting it." "Neither was I, actually. It just..." He made a short, helpless gesture with his free hand. "It just happened." She nodded. She set the chart back on the hook. "Get some sleep." "You too." She was at the door when he said, "Bennett." She turned. "Whatever they say about 2019, he said quietly, "the guys who were there know what actually happened. We always did." She stood in the doorway for a moment with that. It didn't fix anything. But it was the kind of thing that, when you had been carrying something for 3 years, landed differently than you expected. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. The investigation formally expanded at 9 a.m. Captain Sloan had done something the previous evening that Nora hadn't known about until Derek texted her at 8:50. She had contacted the Montana State Board of Medicine directly, not as a courtesy, but as a formal notification that a federal legal proceeding was examining clinical conduct at Carver Peak Medical Center and requesting coordination on any parallel state-level inquiry. The board had responded by 8 a.m. A state investigator named Douglas Farr arrived at the hospital at 9 o'clock with the particular quiet efficiency of a man who had done this before and had learned that the way you entered a building set the tone for everything that followed. He was 50s, gray, and wore reading glasses he didn't seem to need except to look at documents up close, which he did with a patience that was itself a form of pressure. He set up in the conference room adjacent to Kellum's office and began requesting files. Nora learned about Farr the same way she learned most things that morning, from Derek, who had positioned himself with the strategic invisibility of someone who understood that a male nurse in hospital scrubs with a chart tucked under his arm could move through almost any administrative space without triggering the instinct to manage him. He asked for the incident report logs, Derek told her, in a corner of the staff lounge that had bad acoustics and good sight lines. The full database. 18 months, son. What did admin say? They handed them over. They didn't have a choice with the preservation order in place. He paused. He also asked for Graves's credentialing file, his board certifications, his performance reviews from the residency program, his malpractice history. And Voss tried to say those were outside the scope of the naval proceeding. They probably are. Farr said he wasn't asking as part of the naval proceeding. He was asking as the state board. Derek's expression was careful. Different authority. Nora absorbed that. The state board could access physician credentialing files independent of any military legal proceeding. Farr hadn't come here just to coordinate. He had come with his own investigative mandate, which meant someone at the state level had already decided there was enough to look at that they were sending a person rather than a letter. Who tipped them? She asked. Derek looked at her steadily. The request was logged at 6:15 a.m. Sloan's notification went out last night around 10. 8 hours. Which meant the state board had reviewed Sloan's notification, made a decision, and dispatched an investigator before most of the hospital's administrative staff had arrived for the day. They were already watching, Nora said. That's what I think, Derek said. She found Maya at 11:30 in the parking structure 2 blocks from the hospital where they had agreed to meet if direct communication at the hospital became complicated. Maya was in her car, which was parked on the 3rd level, and she had the engine running for the heat because the Montana morning had not warmed the way it should have for the month. Nora got in the passenger seat. Farr asked to speak with me, Maya said. Her hands were on the wheel even though the car wasn't moving. His office called my cell at 9. Are you going to? I already did. Maya turned to look at her. This morning, 2 hours ago, I went in through the side entrance and sat with him for 45 minutes, and I walked him through every folder. Nora waited. He already knew about 2 of the cases, Maya said. Not from me. From somewhere else. He wouldn't tell me where, but he had notes that predated everything I gave him. She paused. One of the cases I documented. The patient in room 14 last October. The one where the nursing assessment was modified after Graves overruled it. There was a family complaint. The patient's daughter filed a formal grievance with the hospital 7 months ago. I didn't know that. Neither did I. The grievance was reviewed by administration and closed. Maya's voice was steady in the way that took effort to maintain. Closed by Mercer's office. Filed and closed and never forwarded to the state board the way it was legally required to be. The car was quiet except for the engine and the faint sound of the parking structure's ventilation. She buried a patient grievance, Nora said. She buried a patient grievance, Maya confirmed. And Farr has the original filing timestamp and the closure timestamp and the fact that it was never forwarded, which is itself a reportable violation. Nora looked through the windshield at the concrete wall of the parking structure. There was a point in the geometry of an investigation where the thing being investigated was no longer just the original incident, where the cover had become as serious as the underlying misconduct, sometimes more serious, because the cover revealed intent. Graves misreading a presentation was a clinical failure. Graves overruling nurses and then documenting his own version of events was a pattern of conduct. Mercer protecting that pattern for 14 months and burying a formal patient grievance was something that had a different name entirely. Folder 9, Nora said. The record modification log. Did Farr see it? It was the first thing he asked for. And? He spent 12 minutes on that one folder alone. Maya's jaw tightened slightly. He didn't say much, but he asked for a certified copy. Not a scan. A certified copy with a chain of custody notation. A certified copy with chain of custody meant he was preparing it as potential evidence in a proceeding where the authenticity of the document would be challenged. He wasn't investigating anymore. He was building. Okay, Nora said. Okay, Maya repeated. She looked at Nora. What happens now? Now we let it move. Nora opened the door. You did your part. Let the process do its. That's easier to say than to sit with. I know. Nora paused, half out of the car. You drove 40 minutes each way for 8 months to a clinic without an ICU because of what they did to you. You kept those folders for 14 months, waiting for the right moment. You did the hard part before any of this started. She looked at Maya directly. Let someone else carry it for a while. Maya nodded, once, slowly. Nora got out and walked back toward the hospital. The escalation came at 1:15 p.m., and it did not come from the direction anyone had been watching. Nora was in the staff lounge working through her written statement. Sloan had asked for a supplementary narrative covering the entirety of her 11 weeks at Carver Peak, not just the Trauma Bay incident. When Derek came in with the look of someone who had just heard something and was still processing whether it was as significant as his expression suggested. Graves went to Kellum, Derek said, 40 minutes ago. Private meeting, no legal present. About what? I don't know the content, but Kellum came out of the meeting and immediately called the residency program director in Billings, the program that placed Graves here. Nora set down her pen. He's escalating up the chain. Or trying to. Derek sat. The residency director is a man named Harlan Briggs. He's been placing residents at Carver Peak for 6 years. Graves is his 3rd rotation here. He paused. If the investigation touches Graves's conduct across all 3 rotations, not just the current one, Briggs has exposure too. He's the one who certified Graves's competencies for each placement. She understood what that meant. A residency director who had certified an incompetent physician for multiple placements across multiple years was not an uninvolved party. He was either someone who had failed to adequately supervise or someone who had known and looked away. And the distance between those two things, in a formal proceeding, was narrower than people assumed. Farr is going to get to Briggs, she said. He already has. I heard Kellum's assistant on the phone 20 minutes ago. Farr's office requested Briggs's contact information and Graves's full rotation history through the program. Nora picked up her pen and wrote that down. Not because she needed to. She would remember it, but because the written record was becoming the thing that mattered most. And she had learned in environments much less forgiving than this one that you wrote everything down while you still could. There's something else, Derek said. She looked at him. The patient grievance. The one Mercer buried. He set his phone on the table between them, screen up, open to an email. The family? The daughter who filed it. Her name is Rosalie Tran. She filed the grievance in March. She got the closure letter in April. She never stopped trying to get someone to listen. He paused. She contacted the state nursing board independently 3 months ago. They logged the contact but didn't open a formal inquiry. Farr found the log this morning. Nora read the email on his screen. It was a summary Derek had typed up from what he'd heard. He wasn't accessing anything he shouldn't, she noted, just synthesizing what was in the air of a hospital where information was moving fast and not always discreetly. The patient, she said, the one in room 14, what was the outcome? Derek's expression told her before he spoke. He developed a complication that the family believes was related to the delayed diagnosis. He was transferred to a facility in Billings 6 weeks after the initial admission. He stopped. He died there, 4 months ago. The staff lounge was very quiet. Nora sat with that, not performing the weight of it, just actually sitting with it, because there was a patient and a family and a daughter who had filed a grievance and been given a closure letter and kept trying anyway, and the thread connecting that woman's persistence to the folder in Maya's canvas bag, to the needle in Nora's hand 2 days ago, was the same thread, and it ran through everything. Farr knows, she said. Farr knows, Derek confirmed. She stood up and picked up her statement. I need to finish this, she said, and then I need to give it to Sloan tonight. The afternoon produced 2 things Nora hadn't anticipated. The first was a phone call at 2:30 from a number she recognized as a DoD administrative line, connected after 3 forwarding transfers to a woman named Colonel Andrea Moss, who identified herself as the deputy director of a DoD medical review division and spoke with the particular economy of someone who billed her time in meaningful units. Ms. Bennett, Moss said, I understand you've been at the center of some activity at Carver Peak. You could say that? I've been briefed by Commander Hale and by Captain Sloane's office. I want to be direct with you. A pause. Your service record request, the one routed through the contractor channel. We've traced the origin. It came from an attorney's office in Billings associated with the residency program. She absorbed that. Briggs's program had an attorney who had, within 36 hours of the Trauma Bay incident, attempted to pull her military service record. That wasn't defensive maneuvering by a doctor trying to protect himself. That was an organized institutional response. They were looking for something to use against me, she said. That appears to be the intent, yes. Moss's voice was measured. I want to assure you that the request has been blocked, and the circumstances of the request are being reviewed by our office as a potential improper access attempt. Civilian attorneys accessing military personnel records through contractor channels without authorization is... She paused. It's not something we take lightly. What does this mean for the investigation here? It means you're not fighting a single surgical resident, Moss said, which I suspect you already knew. I had a sense. The residency program director, his institutional attorneys, and by extension the hospital's arrangement with that program. That's the structure you're looking at. Graves is the most visible part of it, but he's not the origin. Nora thought about the 14 months of folders in Maya's canvas bag, about 6 nurses pushed out before her, about a pattern that had continued because the structure above it had made sure it could. What do you need from me? She asked. Your written statement, which I understand you're preparing, and your authorization to provide your full service record voluntarily to the State Board and to Sloane's office, so that when this goes where I expect it's going, your background is part of the official record rather than a document someone tried to access without your knowledge. She thought about that for less than 5 seconds. You have my authorization, she said. Oh. The second thing she hadn't anticipated arrived in person at 4:15. She was in the corridor outside the documentation room when she heard footsteps behind her that were moving with a particular purpose. Not the purposeful movement of hospital staff navigating routine, but the deliberate cadence of someone who knew exactly where they were going and had decided how this interaction was going to begin. She turned. Graves was alone. He looked like he hadn't slept since Tuesday, which was either genuine or performed. She couldn't tell from his face, and she had usually been good at reading faces. He stopped a few feet from her, and there was a long moment where neither of them spoke, and she watched him decide how to begin. I want to explain something, he said. You don't have to explain anything to me. I know I don't. He pressed his mouth together. I misread the presentation, okay? I know I did. I've been turning that over for 2 days and I know it. She waited. What I filed... He stopped, started again. The complaint was reflexive, she said. He flinched. I was trying to protect your position, she said. I know, I understand the instinct. She looked at him directly. But a man almost died while you were protecting your position, and that's not something an explanation to me resolves. He looked at the floor. He was somewhere between anger and something more complicated, and she had seen that place before. She had been in that place herself. And she didn't mistake it for remorse exactly, but she also didn't dismiss it as pure performance. The records, he said quietly, the modified records. I need you to know. Don't, she said. He looked up. Don't tell me what you need me to know, she said. Tell Farr. Tell Sloane. Tell Kellum. Document it in writing with a signature and a timestamp. She paused. Whatever you're trying to say to me right now, it doesn't belong in this hallway. It belongs in a formal statement where it can actually matter. He stood there for a moment. Then he nodded, once, and turned and walked away. She watched him go. She didn't feel satisfied. She didn't feel vindicated. She felt the specific fatigue of a conversation that had required more precision than the energy she had available, in a day that had required more of everything than most days were designed to contain. She turned back toward the documentation room. Sloane called at 6 p.m. The Tran family, she said, without preamble. Rosalie Tran. She's willing to provide a formal statement. Farr's office contacted her this afternoon. How is she? Composed, angry. She's been waiting for 8 months for someone to treat her complaint as something other than a box to be checked. A pause. She also has copies of the correspondence with the hospital. The original grievance filing, the closure letter, and 4 follow-up emails she sent to Mercer's office that were never answered. 4 unanswered emails from a woman whose father had died. What does Farr need? Nora asked. He's requesting a full administrative hearing before the state board. Formal, not a review, a hearing. He's going to recommend emergency suspension of Graves's clinical privileges pending the outcome. Emergency suspension was not a routine instrument. It required the state board to conclude that continued clinical practice by the physician posed an ongoing risk to patients. A higher bar than finding misconduct had occurred. The fact that Farr was recommending it meant he believed the evidence was strong enough to clear that bar. Timeline? Nora asked. He wants the hearing within 10 days. Sloane's voice was careful. That's fast. It's going to put pressure on the hospital to respond quickly and publicly. And on Briggs? And on Briggs. Another pause. Nora, I need to tell you something. She waited. Your voluntary disclosure, the service record authorization you gave Moss this afternoon. She moved quickly. Your full 201 was transmitted to my office and to Farr's office 2 hours ago. A pause. Farr read it. And? He came to find me in the conference room. He sat down and he said, Sloane seemed to choose her words carefully. He said, why is a decorated combat trauma officer who was fast-tracked for field command serving on restricted duty at a regional hospital in Montana because a surgical resident filed a complaint against her for saving a patient? Nora closed her eyes for a moment. Not because of the question, because of the answer she had been carrying for 3 years, and how strange it was to hear someone else articulate the question so cleanly. What did you tell him? She asked. I told him to ask you. A beat. But Nora, the record also includes the 2019 review, and I need to know if there's anything in that review that someone could use to complicate your position here, because if there is, I need to know before it surfaces somewhere I can't manage it. Nora stood in the documentation room, alone, in the quiet of a hospital evening. The 2019 review. The incident in a forward operating base in a country whose name she didn't say out loud anymore. The triage decision. The soldier she had lost. The 3 months of internal proceedings. The clearance. And the thing she had never fully told anyone. The thing that lived below the official record, in the space between what had been documented and what she had actually experienced in the 40 seconds between making the decision and the moment the outcome became permanent. There's nothing in the record that should affect this investigation, she said. The review concluded with full clearance. No adverse findings, no disciplinary action. But, Sloane said, Nora looked at the wall of the documentation room. At the bare institutional paint, the same color as every documentation room in every hospital she had ever worked in. But there's something I've never submitted formally because it wasn't relevant to the investigation's outcome, she said. A detail I've kept out of every official account because I didn't think it changed the conclusion. Does it? No, she said. But it changes how the conclusion feels. She paused. And someone who wanted to use it against me, someone who framed it right, could make it look like I had a reason to hide it. Sloane was quiet for a long moment. Tell me, she said. And Nora, who had spent 3 years not telling anyone, who had moved to a small hospital in Montana and picked up a mop and made herself smaller specifically so that she would never have to have this conversation, sat down in the chair in the documentation room in the quiet of a hospital evening and told her. She was halfway through when her phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't have stored. She looked at it. Stop talking. Your room is not secure. She stopped mid-sentence. Sloane, she said. Someone just texted me. Unknown number. They said my room isn't secure. A sharp silence. What room are you in? Documentation, 4th floor, northeast corner. Don't move. The sound of Sloane pushing back from something, standing. Don't say anything else. I'm coming to you. Nora put the phone down and looked slowly around the room. At the ceiling, at the corners, at the ventilation grill above the door, at the desk phone on the counter to her left. The desk phone. She looked at it for a long moment. It was a standard hospital handset, the kind installed in every room, connected to the hospital's internal communication system. Standard equipment, unremarkable, present in every documentation room on every floor. She picked it up. She held it to her ear. The line was open. Not with dial tone, with the particular electronic silence of an open, active connection that someone had established and left running, feeding whatever was being said in this room to somewhere else in the building. She set the handset down very carefully without closing the connection. Then she picked up her personal phone and texted the unknown number back. "Who are you?" The response came in 4 seconds. "Someone who works here and doesn't want to. We need to talk. Not tonight. Tomorrow. Alone. I have something Farr doesn't know about yet, and neither does Sloan. Something that was kept out of every record you've seen because it was never entered into the system at all." She stared at the message. "What is it?" she typed. The response took longer this time. 11 seconds. "It's a name. A second physician. Someone who reviewed Graves's assessments and signed off on them for 14 months, who is not in any of Maya's folders and is not in the hospital's personnel directory, and has never appeared in any document connected to this case." Her pulse was steady. It was always steady when the situation was serious. That was one of the things combat had given her, the recalibration of her body's alarm system to stop sounding in moments that required thinking. "A second physician," she typed. "Who?" The 3 dots appeared, stopped, appeared again. Then, "Someone you've already met, someone who has been in this building every day of this investigation. Someone who told you this morning that your record was clean and that they were working to help you." Nora read the message twice. Then she looked at the open desk phone connection. Then she looked at the door. Nora stood up. She did it slowly, without urgency, because urgency in a room with an open phone line was information she wasn't ready to give. She collected her pen and her legal pad and her personal phone in the natural sequence of someone finishing an evening's work, and she walked to the door and opened it and stepped into the corridor. She kept walking until she reached the stairwell at the end of the hall, pushed through the fire door, and let it close behind her. The stairwell was concrete and cold and acoustically isolated in the way that stairwells are. Sound didn't carry in, and it didn't carry out. She looked at her phone. The unknown number was still the last message in her text thread. She read it again. "Someone you've already met. Someone who has been in this building every day of this investigation. Someone who told you this morning that your record was clean and that they were working to help you." She ran through the morning. The people who had told her those things, or some version of them. Hale had told her the record request was being managed. Sloan had told her the disclosure was processed, and her record was clean. Farr she hadn't spoken to directly. She had only heard about him through Derek and Maya. 3 people who fit the description. One of them was already on the phone waiting for her to come to the documentation room, which meant Sloan hadn't sent the text. That left Hale. Or someone who had been present in the same conversations as Hale, one of his people, one of the operators, someone adjacent to the unit who had access to what Hale knew and was using it as credentialing. Or it was someone else entirely who had framed the message to sound like it could be Hale, because they knew she'd been talking to him, and they wanted her off balance and uncertain before they asked her for something. She typed, "Give me a name, yours, not the physician's." The dots appeared, stopped, appeared. "Ortega. I'm a physical therapist on the 2nd floor. I've worked here for 3 years. I won't come to you because I don't know who's watching what right now. If you want what I have, come to the PT gym on the 2nd floor at 7 a.m. tomorrow. Come alone and don't tell Sloan or Hale beforehand." She read that 4 times. Then she texted back, "Why not tell them?" "Because the second physician is someone with enough reach in this hospital that if the wrong person hears I've been talking, I lose more than my job. I've been sitting on this for 6 months. I've been waiting for something to change the calculus. You changed it, but I need to know you're not going to hand me to a process I don't control before I've decided I'm okay with that." She put the phone in her pocket. She pushed out of the stairwell and walked back toward the 4th floor conference room, where she could hear Sloan's voice before she reached the door. Quick, controlled, the voice of someone who had arrived to find a situation and was assembling its parameters. Sloan looked up when Nora came in. "You left the room." The desk phone was on an open line. Nora set her legal pad on the table. "Someone accessed it from inside the building. I left before I said anything else." Sloan's expression didn't change dramatically, but something focused behind her eyes. "How long was it open?" "I don't know when it was opened. Long enough that anything I said from the time I started my statement could have been heard." "What did you tell me before you noticed it?" Nora thought back. The broad shape of the 2019 review. Nothing specific. I was midway through when the text came in. Sloan pulled out her own phone and made a call. She spoke in short, clipped sentences to someone Nora couldn't identify, and the content of the call was a request to sweep the fourth-floor documentation room and cross-reference the desk phone access log with the hospital's internal communication records. She ended the call and set the phone down. "Who sent the text?" Sloan asked. "Someone named Ortega, PT department, second floor, 3 years at Carver Peak." Nora paused. "They say there's a second physician, someone not in any of the documents we've seen, someone who reviewed and signed off on Graves's assessments for 14 months outside the official system." Sloan was very still, off the record. "Appears that way." Nora met her eyes. "They want to meet tomorrow morning, alone. They're not willing to come forward through formal channels yet." "Then I can't be there." "I know." Nora sat down. "That's why I'm telling you tonight instead of tomorrow afternoon." Sloan looked at her for a moment. The look of someone recalculating what they knew about a person they thought they had already accurately assessed. "You're going to go?" "Yes." "And if what Ortega says is credible, then I'll bring you what I can verify independently," Nora said. "Ortega keeps their own exposure until they decide to do otherwise. I don't hand someone to a process before they've had the chance to make that choice. That's not how investigations work." "I know how investigations work," Nora said, and the steadiness in her voice carried just enough weight that Sloan didn't push it further. She didn't sleep cleanly, but she slept. At 6:40 a.m., she walked into the hospital through the main entrance, took the elevator to the second floor, and followed the corridor signage to the physical therapy gym, a room she had passed a dozen times in 11 weeks without ever going into, the way you don't go into the rooms that aren't yours. The gym was empty except for one person. Rosa Ortega was 40 years old, with the compact build of someone who spent their days doing active physical work and the eyes of someone who had spent a long time watching things they wished they hadn't seen. She was folding resistance bands at the supply counter when Nora came in, and she didn't look up immediately. She finished what she was doing first, which Nora respected as a choice. "You came alone," Ortega said. "I said I would." Ortega set down the last band and turned around. She studied Nora for a moment, not unfriendly, but assessing, the way people assess when they're deciding how much to trust what their instincts are telling them. "I heard what happened in the trauma bay," Ortega said. "I've been on this floor. I've watched what they do to nurses who push back. I watched Maya leave. I watched 2 others before her." She paused. "I kept telling myself it wasn't my lane. But Rosalie Tron came in here 6 months ago." Ortega's voice was controlled in a way that controlled voices get when they're managing something that doesn't want to be managed. "She came in to ask me about her father. He had a course of physical therapy after his initial admission. I was his therapist for 3 weeks. She wanted to know what I had observed during that time." Nora waited. "He was declining in ways that weren't being addressed," Ortega said. "I documented my observations in the PT notes. Standard practice. I flagged for physician review twice. Both times the flag was acknowledged, and then the PT notes were modified. Not deleted. Modified. The language was softened. Patient demonstrating reduced tolerance for weight-bearing activity became patient progressing appropriately with standard mobility protocol." She looked at Nora steadily. "I didn't do that. Someone else accessed my notes and changed them. You can prove this. I have screenshots of both versions. I took them the same day I noticed the modifications because by that point I had watched it happen to enough people that I knew to look." Ortega reached under the supply counter and pulled out a small envelope. Inside were printed pages. 2 pairs of documents, each pair showing a before and after, the modification timestamps visible in the corner of each page. The modification timestamps show who made the access. Nora looked at the pages. The accessing user ID on both modifications was not Graves. It was not Mercer. It was a user ID she hadn't seen before, a string of letters and numbers that meant nothing to her until she looked at the bottom of the second page where Ortega had written, in small, careful handwriting, a name. Dr. Harlan Briggs, the residency program director, the man in Billings who had placed Graves at Carver Peak, the man whose attorney had tried to pull Nora's military service record within 36 hours of the trauma bay incident. "He has system access here?" Nora asked. "He's a visiting clinical supervisor on the residency program's oversight agreement. He has read access to resident-related patient files." Ortega's jaw was tight. Modifying those files is not within his authorized access level. But the system logged the modification under his credentials, which means either he did it himself or someone used his credentials. Which do you think? I think he did it himself. Ortega looked at the envelope. Because I've seen him in this building. He's here 2-3 times a month for oversight visits. He always goes directly to Graves's cases. And twice, I don't have documentation of this, only my own recollection. I saw him in Mercer's office with the door closed, outside of any scheduled visit. Nora thought about Colonel Moss's words the previous afternoon. You're not fighting a single surgical resident. She thought about the attorney's office in Billings, and the contractor channel, and the 36-hour window. She thought about 14 months of a pattern continuing because the structure above it had made sure it could. Briggs wasn't just the man who had placed Graves, he was the man who had been maintaining Graves, covering the record, managing the documentation, keeping the structure intact from the top, while Mercer managed it from the inside. Ortega, she said, are you willing to give these to the State Board investigator? Ortega looked at the envelope in Nora's hands. I've been asking myself that for 6 months. And now? And now Rosalie Tran's father is dead, and I'm the person who saw it happening and took screenshots instead of doing something that mattered. Her voice was flat and honest and carrying something Nora recognized as the particular weight of a decision that had already been made and was only now being said out loud. Yes, I'm willing. Nora brought the documents to Farr at 8:15, with Ortega beside her. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. Farr was the same as he had been the previous day. Reading glasses, patient attention, the manner of a man who had learned that what witnesses needed most was to feel that what they were saying was being heard rather than processed. He let Ortega speak at length without interrupting, and when he did ask questions, they were precise and unhasty, and they were exactly the right questions. When Ortega was done, Farr looked at the modification timestamps for a long time. Dr. Briggs's access credentials, he said. Can you confirm these are his and not a shared login? The system assigns individual credentials by employee and visiting supervisor ID, Ortega said. He was issued his at the start of the residency oversight agreement. The IT log will show the full access history under that credential. We have the IT log, Farr said. He looked at his notes. We've had it since the preservation order. We weren't looking at this user ID because it wasn't in any of the documents we'd reviewed. He paused. We were looking at resident-level access, not supervisory. He closed his folder. I need to make a call, he said, and the quality of it, the decision in his voice, told Nora that the call was not a courtesy. It was the next step in a sequence that was now moving faster than it had been moving 20 minutes ago. The call Farr made was to the Montana State Board of Medicine. After that call, the board made a call to the Montana Attorney General's office. These calls happened between 9 and 10 a.m., and Nora wasn't present for them, but she understood their outcome by 10:15 when Sloan found her in the second-floor corridor and said, without ceremony, Briggs is being contacted today. Formally? Formally. The AG's office has the modification logs and Ortega's statement. Combined with the burial of the Tran grievance and the credentialing pattern across 3 residency placements, they have enough to open a parallel inquiry separate from the state board investigation. She paused. Nora, this is bigger than I thought it was 48 hours ago. I know. Graves is one data point. Briggs is the infrastructure. I know, Nora said again. What happens to Graves? The emergency suspension recommendation goes to the board today. Farr filed it this morning. Sloan looked at her with a directness that had no performance in it. His clinical privileges will be suspended by end of day, pending the formal hearing. The hospital has been notified. The notification reached Kellum's office at 11 a.m. Nora was not in the building when Kellum confronted Graves, but Derek was, in the peripheral way that Derek had perfected, and he told her about it afterward with the accuracy of someone who had been close enough to hear and far enough to be invisible. Kellum had called Graves into his office and closed the door. He had the suspension notification on his desk, and he had, beside it, a printout of the Meridian data and a copy of Ortega's statement and a summary of the modification timestamps showing Briggs's user ID. He had looked at all of it for a long time before Graves arrived, and by the time Graves sat down across from him, Kellum was not a man in the process of deciding what he thought. He was a man who had already decided and was now doing what administrators do when the decision is clear and uncomfortable and necessary. "Walk me through your relationship with Dr. Briggs," Kellum said. And Graves, who had spent 4 days managing his exposure with the careful tactical instinct of someone who understood that his career depended on it. Graves, who had filed a complaint against a woman who saved his patient, who had mobilized an attorney in Billings within 36 hours, who had done all of it with the systematic precision of someone who had navigated institutional problems before, looked at the modification logs with Briggs's credentials and understood that the structure he had been operating inside had just become the thing that was going to bury him. He didn't say what Derek expected him to say. He said, "I think I need an attorney." Kellum nodded. "I think you do." I was escorted from the building by hospital security at 11:40, not dramatically, no scene, no raised voices, but publicly enough that every nurse on the floor who had spent 14 months being managed, corrected, documented around, and quietly pushed out saw him go. Derek texted Nora 2 words. "He's out." She read it, standing in the parking structure where she had sat with Maya 3 days ago, and she felt something she would have described, if pressed, as relief rather than satisfaction, because satisfaction suggested an end, and this was not the end of anything. It was the part where the weight of what had been built incorrectly started coming apart, and that process was loud and structural and ongoing and did not feel like victory while it was happening. She texted back, "How are the nurses taking it?" Derek's response took a minute. Quiet, but the kind of quiet that means a lot. Mercer resigned at 1 p.m. It was not dramatic in its delivery. A letter to Kellum's office, formal and brief, citing personal reasons, which was the language that covered every real reason that a person in her position could not say out loud in a resignation letter. She was out of the building by 2. Her office was locked by 3. The resignation did not protect her. Farr's office had the buried grievance. The AG's office had the modification logs. Sloan had the 14 months of documentation from Maya's folders and the desk phone access log and the open line recording, which the hospital's IT department had traced to a device registered to a user in the administrative wing, a device registered to Mercer's office extension. She had listened to Nora's conversation with Sloan through an open phone line the previous evening, or she had tried to, because what she had heard before Nora walked out of the documentation room was the broad shape of the 2019 review, which gave her nothing, and the moment where Nora stopped mid-sentence, which told her that Nora had understood what was happening. What Mercer had not heard was anything about Ortega or Briggs's credentials or the PT note modifications, because all of that had happened after Nora left the room and before Sloan arrived. The open phone line had told Mercer almost nothing useful and had confirmed for Farr's office via the IT access log that someone in hospital administration had deliberately accessed the documentation room's phone line during an active investigation, which was itself a serious enough act that the AG's office included it in their preliminary findings summary filed that afternoon. Nora found out about the resignation from Sloan at 2:30 in the 4th-floor conference room that had become, over the preceding 3 days, the functional center of an investigation that had started as a single complaint against a nurse and had become something that involved 2 physicians, 1 hospital administrator, a residency program director, a state attorney general's office, a naval legal proceeding, and the family of a patient who had died 4 months ago, waiting for someone to listen to his daughter. "How are you doing?" Sloan asked her, which was the first time since Tuesday that anyone had asked that question in a way that expected a real answer. Nora considered it. "I'm tired," she said, "and I'm not done being tired yet." "No," Sloan agreed. "Not yet." Well, the formal board hearing was scheduled for 8 days out. In those 8 days, several things happened in sequence that were each significant enough to alter the landscape of what the hearing would address. Briggs, contacted by the AG's office on Thursday, retained an attorney and declined to make a statement. His attorney issued a letter asserting that his client's system access at Carver Peak had been appropriate within the scope of his supervisory role, and that any document modification had been performed within his authorized capacity as a visiting clinical supervisor. The letter was specific and carefully worded and contained one claim: that modification of resident-related patient documentation was within supervisory scope, that the hospital's IT access agreement explicitly contradicted. Farr flagged that contradiction and forwarded it to the AG's office by Friday morning. On Friday afternoon, a second former nurse from Carver Peak contacted the state board. Her name was Serena Walsh, and she had left Carver Peak 16 months ago, which put her departure 2 months before Maya's. She had kept nothing as systematic as Maya's folders, but she had personal emails she had sent herself from her hospital account before her access was revoked, flagging specific clinical concerns and Graves's responses to them. The emails were time-stamped and had not been modified because they existed on a personal server rather than a hospital system. She turned them over to Farr on Saturday. On Sunday, Rosalie Tran arrived in Harlan. She had driven from Billings 6 hours alone. Sloan had offered to arrange a formal setting, a video call, a scheduled deposition, all the mechanisms of a proceeding designed to manage the discomfort of people who had been harmed. Rosalie had declined all of them. She had called Sloan's direct number and asked to come in person, and Sloan had said yes. Nora was not in the room when Rosalie gave her statement, but she was in the corridor outside when Rosalie came out, and Rosalie was a woman in her early 30s with her father's eyes. Nora knew this without knowing it, the intuitive recognition of a person carrying someone else's face, and she looked at Nora with an expression that was not what Nora expected. It was not anger. It was not grief. Or rather, it was both of those things, but underneath them was something more like relief. The specific and complicated relief of a person who has been told for 8 months that what they saw was not significant and has finally been told that it was. "You're the nurse," Rosalie said. "I'm a nurse," Nora said. "My father's therapist told me about you, what you did." She paused. He would have said something about it. He liked people who did the right thing in complicated situations. Nora didn't know what to say to that, so she said, "I'm sorry about your father." Rosalie nodded. She looked at the floor and then back up. "Did you know when you were doing it, when you saved that soldier, did you know what was going to happen after, that it would turn into all of this?" Nora thought about the trauma bay, about 68 on the monitor, about the decision that had not felt like a decision at all, because it was the only thing that made sense. "No," she said. "I just knew what I was looking at." Rosalie was quiet for a moment. "I think that's what my father needed. Someone who knew what they were looking at." She picked up her bag from the chair beside the door. "I hope whatever they do to the people responsible is proportionate to what they actually did." "The board takes that seriously," Nora said, "for what it's worth." "I know." Rosalie looked at her one more time. "Thank you for being the kind of person who picks up a needle." She walked down the corridor toward the elevator, and Nora watched her go, and did not say what she was thinking, which was that being the kind of person who picked up a needle had cost her 3 years and 1 set of service records she had spent a long time wishing didn't exist, and that it had still been the only thing worth being. The hearing convened on a Thursday. The Montana State Board of Medicine met in a formal hearing room in the state office building, not in the hospital, not in Harlan, but in Helena, which was a 2.5-hour drive that Nora made with Derek, both of them quiet for most of it, in the way of people who have been moving fast inside a compressed timeline and have finally reached the moment that the timeline was building toward. The room had 12 people in it when they arrived. 7 board members, 2 legal representatives, Farr at the investigative table, Sloan in a civilian capacity as an observer, and 2 chairs along the wall for witnesses. Graves was present with his attorney. Briggs was not. His attorney had submitted a written statement asserting his client's inability to attend due to health reasons, which Farr's expression suggested he found interesting in its timing. The hearing was formal and structured, and moved at the pace of institutional proceedings, which was not fast. Nora had been through institutional proceedings before, had sat in rooms very much like this one in 2019, in a different capacity, on a different side of the table, and she understood that the discomfort of the pace was itself a design feature. It was supposed to feel slow. The slowness was where the truth had room to be examined rather than managed. Farr presented the investigation's findings in 4 sections. The first was the Meridian monitor data and the timeline of the trauma bay incident, the 9-minute decline, the 2 verbal warnings, the complaint filed, and the IT lockdown initiated within 5 minutes of each other. The second was Maya's folders, the 14-month pattern of nursing assessments overruled and then documented away, the modified clinical notes, the incident reports that had disappeared from the official record and survived only because a former nurse had been meticulous and frightened enough to photograph them. The third was the Tran case, the patient whose physical therapy notes had been modified under Briggs's system credentials, the adverse outcome, the daughter's grievance that had been received and buried and never forwarded to the state board as legally required. The fourth was the desk phone access log, the IT record showing Mercer's office device accessing the documentation room phone line during an active investigation, and the preliminary AG findings characterizing the access as an act of deliberate obstruction. Each section landed differently. The first produced visible tension in the board members, the kind that comes from reviewing data that is unambiguous and understanding its implications. The second produced something heavier, the sustained attention of people working through a pattern that was large enough to require time to see in full. The third produced a silence that lasted almost a minute after Farr finished presenting, and in that silence, Rosalie Tran, who was seated in the witness gallery, which was public, was visible to everyone in the room, and no one looked at her, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. The fourth produced a question from the board chair. Is Ms. Mercer subject to separate proceedings? The AG's office has opened a formal inquiry, Farr said. It's active. And Dr. Briggs? Also under active AG inquiry. The board will receive a coordination notification within the next 10 days. Graves was asked to respond to the investigation's findings. He stood. His attorney stood beside him. The attorney began with the prepared statement, the careful language of a representation designed to acknowledge a clinical error while contesting the characterization of intent, to separate the misread presentation from the modified records, to argue that the complaint filed against Nora had been a good-faith response to what Graves had understood as a procedural breach at the time. The board chair interrupted the attorney's third paragraph. The complaint, she said, filed at 2:47 p.m. The IT lockdown request filed at 2:52. Can Dr. Graves explain the 5-minute interval? Graves' attorney began a response. The chair held up a hand. I'd like to hear from Dr. Graves. Graves looked at the board. 7 people who had read the same documents he had seen over the preceding week and had drawn conclusions that were visible in the way they were sitting, the particular set of their attention. He said, I was aware that the monitor data would not reflect well on my response time. The room absorbed that. The chair said, that is not the same as explaining the interval. No, Graves said, it isn't. His attorney touched his arm. Graves sat down. It wasn't a confession, not legally, not formally, but it was the collapse of the alternative account, which, in a proceeding like this, was the functional equivalent. Once the alternative was gone, only the documented record remained, and the documented record said what it said. The board recessed at 12:30. They returned at 2 p.m. The chair read the findings in the flat, procedural language of formal institutional conclusions, which did not match the weight of what it was saying. Emergency suspension of Dr. Ethan Graves's clinical privileges, effective immediately, pending formal license review. Referral of the complete investigation file to the residency program's accrediting body with a recommendation for program review. Referral to the AG's office of the buried Tran grievance as a potential violation of mandatory reporting statutes. Notification to every hospital where Graves had held privileges in the previous 3 years. She paused. Then she added, the board also finds that the complaint filed against Ms. Nora Bennett on Tuesday of last week has no evidentiary basis and is hereby formally dismissed with prejudice. Ms. Bennett's clinical record at this institution is clear of adverse findings. The board notes, for the formal record, that her intervention in the trauma bay on the day in question was clinically appropriate, medically sound, and consistent with the standard of care expected of an experienced trauma practitioner. Nora was seated in the witness gallery. She did not react visibly, but Derek, sitting beside her, heard the breath she let out. Quiet, controlled, the exhale of someone who had been holding something in for longer than the preceding week, who had been holding it since the morning in 2019, when she had decided that the only way to be safe was to be smaller, and who had spent 11 weeks mopping floors in a Montana hospital as the physical expression of that decision. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Outside the building, in the parking lot, in the gray Helena afternoon with the mountains visible at the edge of the sky, Hale was waiting. Not because he had been in the hearing, he hadn't, but he had known the schedule, and he was standing by his vehicle with his arms crossed, and when Nora came out, he walked toward her and stopped a few feet away. Board dismissed the complaint, he said. They did. Clean record. So I hear. He looked at her. I owe you an apology. She waited. When I found you at Carver Peak, he said, mopping the floor. When I realized what you'd been doing and where you'd ended up. He paused. I should have done something about that earlier. I knew where you were. I knew why you'd left. I let you... He stopped. I let you make yourself small because it seemed like what you needed, and I should have... Hale, she said. I let myself make myself small. That's not something you were responsible for managing. Still. You're here now, she said, and you blocked the record request and you brought Sloan and you didn't let Kowalski die. That's enough. He looked at her with the expression of a man who disagreed but was choosing not to press the disagreement. What are you going to do now? He asked. She looked at the mountains. She thought about Kellum's office, where she had received a message that morning, a formal one, signed with his name and the hospital's letterhead, requesting a meeting at her convenience to discuss her role at Carver Peak going forward. She thought about what a role at Carver Peak going forward might look like, what it might be worth, what she might build in a place that now had to reckon with 14 months of documented harm and the institutional gaps that had allowed it. She thought about 6 nurses, about Maya, 40 minutes outside the city, working in a clinic without an ICU. About Serena Walsh, who had kept emails on a personal server for 16 months because she hadn't known what else to do with what she'd seen. About Rosalie Tran, who had driven 6 hours to sit in a hearing room and watch the people responsible for her father's death begin to answer for it. I have a meeting with Kellum, she said. Hale nodded slowly. And after that? She looked at him. There was something she had been carrying since Sunday that she hadn't said to anyone. Not to Sloan, not to Derek, not to Hale the night before when he had checked in by phone. Something that had arrived not as a decision, but as a recognition, the kind that comes when you stop running in a particular direction and look at where you've ended up. After that, she said, I'm going to call Maya Reyes and tell her to come back. Hale looked at her. The hospital's going to need nurses who know what happened here and aren't afraid of what they know, she said. That's a short list. Maya should be on it. He nodded. And you? I should be on it too, she said. Apparently. She walked to Derek's car. She got in, and Derek started the engine, and they pulled out of the parking lot onto the road back toward Harlan, and the mountains held their position at the edge of the sky all the way through the first 40 minutes of the drive. Nora's phone buzzed at the 45-minute mark. She looked at it. A message from a number she didn't have stored. Not Ortega's, not Whitmore's, not any of the numbers that had accumulated in her phone over the preceding week. A new one. She opened it. My name is Colonel Andrea Moss. We spoke by phone on Wednesday. I wanted to follow up in person, but I understand you've had a full week. I'll be brief. The DoD Medical Review Division is developing a new joint protocol for civilian-military trauma, credentialing, and cross-institutional clinical practice. Given the circumstances of what occurred at Carver Peak, and given your service record, your input would be valuable. This is not a recall to active duty. It's a consultation. We'd like to talk when you're ready. She read it twice. Then she looked out the window at the road. Derek glanced at her from the driver's seat. Good news or complicated news? Both, she said. How much of each? She put the phone in her pocket. I'll let you know when I figure it out. He nodded and looked back at the road. 40 minutes later, they crossed the city limits into Harlan, and the hospital appeared on the left side of the highway. Carver Peak Medical Center, lit in the late afternoon, running the way it always ran regardless of what occurred inside it. She looked at the building as they passed it and thought about Kellum's message and Moss's message, and Maya working in a clinic 40 minutes outside the city, and the Tran family and the 12 folders and the desk phone with the open line and 11 weeks of mop buckets. She thought about what it meant to be the right person in the wrong position and what it cost to keep proving it, and whether the cost was still worth what it bought. And then, because the answer to that question had not actually changed since she had walked into that trauma bay 4 days ago with 68 on the monitor, and a patient whose trachea was deviating, because the answer to that question had never really changed. Not once, not in 12 years of service and 3 years of deliberate smallness. She stopped thinking about it and looked at the road ahead. Behind them, in Helena, a hearing room was being closed, and a record was being sealed, and the board chair was signing her name to a set of findings that would take months to fully resolve, but that had already, irrevocably, begun. And in a building in Billings, in an office that Nora had never entered, and whose occupant she had never met face to face, Dr. Harlan Briggs sat across from his attorney and read a document that his attorney had just received, a formal AG investigative subpoena for every record, communication, correspondence, and access log associated with his role as residency program director at every institution where he had placed residents in the previous 6 years. Not just Carver Peak. Every institution. 6 years. His attorney looked at him and said, "I need you to tell me everything, starting from the beginning, and I need you to understand that whatever you tell me now is going to determine what our options are, because the AG's office does not typically open a 6-year subpoena for a single institution." Briggs looked at the document. He thought about 14 months of access logs bearing his credentials, about a contract with an institutional attorney who had tried to pull a military service record through a contractor channel, about 3 residency placements at Carver Peak and the residents who had preceded Graves and what their records contained and who had signed the certifications that had cleared them for placement. He thought about what the subpoena meant and what 6 years meant and what the AG's office had figured out that he had not managed to prevent them from figuring out. And then he asked his attorney a question that his attorney, to her credit, answered with complete honesty. She said, "No, at this stage there are no good options." Briggs's attorney was right about the options. There weren't any good ones. There were only degrees of bad arranged along a spectrum from managed damage to complete exposure, and the distance between those two poles had been narrowing since Tuesday morning when a blonde nurse in a Montana hospital had walked back into a trauma bay and picked up a needle. By the time his attorney said what she said in that Billings office, the spectrum had collapsed to a single point. There was only one thing left to do, and it was the thing that people in Briggs's position always told themselves they would never do until the moment arrived when it was the only rational choice remaining. He cooperated. It took him 4 days to decide and 1 afternoon to begin. His attorney contacted the AG's office on a Monday, 2 weeks after the hearing, and the terms of cooperation were negotiated over 3 days with the particular careful formality of a process designed to extract maximum information while making minimum promises. What Briggs gave them, in exchange for a cooperation agreement that reduced but did not eliminate his personal exposure, was the full structure of what he had built, or rather, what he had inherited and maintained and expanded, because it turned out that Graves was not the first resident whose record he had managed, and Carver Peak was not the first institution where the management had required document access and modification and the careful burial of inconvenient observations by nursing staff. There had been 2 residents before Graves, one at Carver Peak, placed 3 years prior, whose rotation had ended with a quiet non-renewal rather than a formal adverse finding because Briggs had intervened at the credentialing level before anything could be formally recorded. One at a hospital in Missoula 4 years prior, where a similar pattern had produced a similar set of interventions and a similar series of nurses who had been managed out of their positions when their documentation became inconvenient. Briggs had not, he told his attorney, and then the AG, understood himself to be participating in harm. He had understood himself to be participating in the protection of a program, a residency program that had taken 15 years to build, that placed physicians across 3 states, that was tied to an academic partnership that funded research positions and faculty salaries, and a clinical education infrastructure that served a region that was underserved and rural and desperate for trained physicians. He had told himself that the residents he was protecting were fundamentally good physicians, who made errors that could be corrected with supervision rather than exposure. He had told himself that the nurses who were documenting those errors were not always right, that clinical disagreement was not the same as misconduct, that the line between advocacy for a resident and the suppression of legitimate concern was one he was navigating carefully. He had been wrong about the line. He understood that now. Whether he had understood it at the time and chosen to proceed anyway was something the AG's office was going to spend several months determining, and the answer to that question was going to determine the difference between a civil finding and something that required a different category of consequence. Farr received the cooperation summary on a Wednesday and spent 2 hours reading it in the conference room at Carver Peak, which had become, in the preceding 2 weeks, the functional headquarters of an investigation that was larger than anyone in that hospital had expected to be part of when it began. He called Nora at 4 p.m. "Briggs is cooperating," he said. "Full scope. 2 additional institutions, 2 additional former residents, a credentialing pattern, going back 6 years. She was in the parking lot of a grocery store in Harlan, which was where she had been going before her phone rang, and she sat in the driver's seat with the engine running and absorbed what he was saying. "The Missoula Hospital," she said. "Were there nursing complaints?" 3. 2 were managed internally. 1 was filed with the state board 4 years ago and closed without investigation. A pause. "The nurse who filed it is still practicing, in Missoula, at a different institution. Farr's office is reaching out to her this week." Nora looked through the windshield at the grocery store entrance. "How many nurses total?" she said. "Across all 3 institutions." "We're still mapping it. Preliminary count is 11. He paused again, longer this time. "Nora, the scope of this is going to take months to fully adjudicate. But the immediate findings, the hearing outcomes, the suspensions, the AG inquiry, those are going into the public record in the next 2 weeks. I wanted you to know before you read it somewhere else." "Thank you," she said. "One more thing. The accrediting body for Briggs's program contacted Kellum's office today. They're opening a full program review. All 3 institutions, all residents placed over 6 years. They've suspended new placements pending the outcome." She understood what that meant. The residency program, the thing Briggs had said he was protecting, the structure he had maintained at the cost of 11 nurses and at least 1 patient's life, was going to be dismantled and examined piece by the people responsible for ensuring that it had been built correctly in the first place. Whether it survived that examination in any recognizable form was not something anyone could predict yet. "Okay," she said. "I wanted to tell you personally because you're the reason any of this started moving," Farr said. "I'm not sentimental about that as a rule, but it seemed worth saying." She almost said something dismissive, the reflexive deflection of a person who had spent 3 years minimizing her own significance. She caught it. "I appreciate that," she said instead, and meant it. She met with Kellum the following morning. His office was different than she'd imagined it, in the way that administrative spaces are always different from what you construct in your head when you've only experienced their occupants' decisions. It was smaller. It had plants, 3 of them, which seemed like a deliberate personal detail in a room otherwise given over to institutional function. He stood when she came in, which was also not what she'd expected. "Ms. Bennett," he said, "thank you for coming." "Dr. Kellum." He gestured to the chairs across from his desk and sat when she did. He looked at her with the specific attention of a man who had spent 2 weeks recalibrating everything he thought he had understood about the institution he ran, and who had arrived at the particular uncomfortable clarity that follows that kind of recalibration. "I want to start by saying something directly," he said. "The 11 weeks you spent at this hospital before last Tuesday were not the experience you should have had. What was assigned to you, how you were treated, what was made available to you, that was wrong, and it was wrong in a way that this administration permitted by not looking closely enough at what was happening below the level of my office." She held his gaze. "That's an honest accounting." "I'm trying." He folded his hands on the desk. "I also want to say that the complaint filed against you was not just wrong as a factual matter. It was a misuse of a system that is supposed to protect patients, and the fact that it was filed and advanced, even briefly, is something the hospital will be accountable for going forward." "There are nurses who left this hospital," she said. "Maya Reyes, Serena Walsh, others. Their departures were engineered by a pattern this hospital allowed to operate for 14 months. Whatever you're doing going forward needs to include them." "I know." He didn't flinch from it. "I've already reached out to Ms. Reyes. The hospital's legal office is reviewing the circumstances of each departure. Correcting the record, formally, with documentation, is part of what we're building." She nodded. "What I wanted to ask you," Kellum said, "is whether you would be willing to take on a senior clinical role. Not as a reward. I want to be clear about that. Not as a way of making the previous 11 weeks seem acceptable, but because this hospital is about to go through a significant structural change, and the person who is best positioned to oversee trauma protocol development, nursing practice standards, and the kind of documentation culture that prevents what happened here from happening again is sitting in that chair." She looked at him. "I'm offering you real authority," he said. "Not a title, not a committee seat. The authority to set clinical standards, build reporting structures, and be the person that nursing staff come to when they see something that the physician on record doesn't want them to see." He paused. I'm offering you the thing this hospital should have offered you before you spent 11 weeks holding a mop. The room was quiet. She thought about what she had told Hale in the parking lot in Helena, about the short list of people who knew what had happened here and weren't afraid of what they knew, about what it meant to be in a position to make sure the next graves couldn't operate for 14 months before anything moved. I have a condition, she said. Tell me. Maya Reyes comes back with a formal position, her record corrected, and a role in the nursing development structure. She spent 14 months documenting what this hospital chose not to see. She earned a place in what comes next. Kellum considered that for exactly as long as it deserved. Agreed. And the nurses who can't come back, the ones who've moved on or built something elsewhere, the hospital reaches out, in writing, with an acknowledgement of what was done. Also agreed. She looked at the plants on the windowsill. You should know I've also had a conversation with the DoD's Medical Review Division. Colonel Moss, she's developing a joint protocol for civilian military trauma credentialing. I may be asked to consult. I'm aware of Moss's work, Kellum said. That doesn't conflict with what I'm describing. It complements it. He looked at her steadily. What do you say? She thought about a number of things in the space of a few seconds. About the difference between being somewhere because you had made yourself small enough to fit and being somewhere because what you were capable of was actually needed. About the 11 weeks and the mop cart and the 68 on the monitor and the salute and the folders and the open phone line and Rosalie Tran's eyes. Yes, she said. Kowalski was discharged on a Friday, 3 weeks after his admission. He walked out of Carver Peak Medical Center on his own, which had not been a certainty in the early days of his recovery, and which he treated with the matter-of-fact resilience of a man who considered walking out of a hospital under his own power a baseline expectation rather than a milestone. He had a follow-up protocol, a chest tube site that was healing correctly, and a respiratory function that Nora had reviewed that morning and signed off on without reservation. She was at the nurse's station on the second floor when he came through, heading toward the elevator. He stopped. I heard about the board hearing, he said. Word travels fast, even out of Helena. Hale tells me things. He looked at her. The direct, unperformative attention of someone who had been trained to assess people accurately and was doing it now without making a production of it. You're staying. I am. Good. He shifted the bag on his shoulder. For what it's worth, so what you did in that bay. I've been through field medicine in bad places. I know what competent looks like under pressure, and I know what exceptional looks like. That was exceptional. You were conscious enough to form that judgment? I was conscious enough to salute, he said. Make of that what you will. She almost smiled. Take care of the chest. Take care of the hospital, he said, and walked to the elevator. She watched him go, and then she turned back to the station, because there were charts, and there was always work, and the morning had more in it than one discharge, no matter how significant the person being discharged was. The public record was released on a Tuesday, 5 weeks after the hearing. It appeared on the state board's official website, a formal published summary of findings, outcomes, and referrals, the kind of document that existed in a register that any licensed practitioner or credentialing body in the country could access. It named Graves by name. It named Briggs by name. It described the pattern of conduct across 14 months. It referenced the AG inquiry. It noted the hospital's cooperation with the investigation and the corrective measures underway. It also, in a single paragraph near the end of the summary, noted that the complaint filed against a staff nurse had been dismissed with prejudice following investigation, and that the nurse's clinical conduct in the incident that triggered the original complaint had been found consistent with appropriate trauma practice standards. It did not name her. Board findings didn't typically name the people they cleared, only the people they sanctioned. But the paragraph was there, in the public record, permanent and retrievable, and part of the official account. Derek found it at 7 a.m. and texted her a link. She read it at her kitchen table with coffee, twice, and then she set her phone down and looked out the window at the Harlan morning, gray and cold and entirely ordinary, the kind of morning that did not signal its own significance. And she sat with it for a while. Not with triumph. That wasn't quite the right word for what she felt. It was closer to completion, the feeling of a knot that had been tightening for 3 years, releasing not all at once, but by degrees, each degree corresponding to something that had been said in a hearing room, or written in an official document, or spoken in a hospital corridor by a woman who had driven 6 hours to be heard. She finished her coffee, she got dressed, she drove to work. The Graves license suspension hearing before the full board was held 6 weeks after the initial proceedings, and it produced an outcome that was neither the harshest possible nor a leniency, which was the particular way of formal proceedings. They almost never produced the most extreme result in either direction, because formal proceedings were designed for the middle distance, for consequences that were proportionate and defensible, and that accounted for the complexity of institutional conduct in a way that pure punishment couldn't. His license was suspended for 24 months, not revoked, suspended. The conditions of eventual reinstatement included a supervised clinical remediation program, a formal ethics review, and a documented evaluation of his capacity to receive and integrate nursing assessments into clinical decision-making. Whether those conditions would ultimately produce the thing they were designed to produce, whether Graves would emerge from the process as a physician who had genuinely learned what he had failed to understand, was not something the board could guarantee. Proceedings don't guarantee transformation, they guarantee consequence. What people do with consequence is its own separate question, one that lives outside the formal record. His attorney issued a statement after the hearing that was carefully worded and said almost nothing. Graves himself said nothing publicly. He left Harlan, left Montana, as far as anyone at Carver Peak could determine, within 2 weeks of the outcome. Briggs's situation took longer to resolve because it was more complex, and complexity in the AG's office moves at its own pace. The cooperation agreement he had negotiated reduced his criminal exposure but did not eliminate it. The formal findings, when they came 4 months later, included license revocation, not suspension, for violations of his supervisory obligations, falsification of credentialing documentation, and the unauthorized modification of patient records across 2 institutions. The revocation was accompanied by a civil penalty and a 5-year bar from holding any supervisory or administrative role in a medical education program in the state of Montana. The bar extended through reciprocity agreements with other state boards to 3 additional states. The residency program he had spent 15 years building was placed into receivership by its accrediting body and assigned a new director under a supervised restructuring. Whether it would survive that process remained uncertain for the better part of a year. Mercer's situation was handled by the AG's office separately from the board proceedings, because the buried Tran grievance was not primarily a medical licensing issue. It was a failure of mandatory reporting that carried its own legal framework. The process was slow, and the outcome when it came was administrative rather than criminal. A formal finding of misconduct, termination of her hospital leadership credentials, and a civil settlement with the Tran family that the hospital's legal office negotiated over several months, and that Rosalie Tran's attorney described as adequate without using the word satisfactory, which was the honest distinction between what money could accomplish and what the situation actually required. The Tran family's formal grievance was updated in the state board system to reflect the full findings. The closure letter that Mercer had issued, the one that had told Rosalie her concern had been reviewed and resolved, was noted in the public record as having been issued in violation of mandatory reporting obligations. The notation was small. It was in a register that most people would never read. But it was permanent, and it was accurate, and it was there. Rosalie Tran called Nora once, 3 months after the Billings hearing. "I'm not sure why I'm calling," she said. "You don't need a reason." A pause. "I read the board summary. The part about the nurse. I saw it. Does it feel like enough?" Nora thought about that question with the honesty it deserved. "It feels like what it is," she said, "which is a formal record that says the right things happened and the wrong things are documented as wrong. That's not the same as enough, but it's what formal records can do." "My father would have appreciated that answer," Rosalie said. "He was a very precise man." "Tell me about him," Nora said. And Rosalie did for 20 minutes, in the way of someone who has been waiting for the opportunity to describe a person rather than a case. A man who had been a high school science teacher for 30 years, who grew tomatoes in the summer and complained about them constantly, who had never once in his life filed a complaint about anything until his daughter had filed one on his behalf and been handed a closure letter. Nora listened. When they said goodbye, she sat for a while in the quiet of her office. She had an office now, which still caught her off guard sometimes. The way spaces you've been assigned as your own take time to feel like they belong to you. and she thought about what it meant to do the right thing in a situation where the right thing was not going to produce a perfect outcome, where the right thing was going to produce an incomplete outcome, marked by loss, complicated by the gap between what the formal record could capture and what the actual human cost of a 14-month pattern of misconduct had been. She thought about the difference between justice and resolution, about how rarely they were the same thing and how much energy she had spent in her life confusing them. Justice was the formal process doing what it was designed to do, naming the wrong, assigning the consequence, correcting the record. Resolution was something that happened, or didn't, in the interior of the people affected, on a timeline that had nothing to do with hearing schedules or board findings. She was still working on her own. Maya came back on a Monday. She drove herself, arriving at 7:15 with a canvas bag over one shoulder and the particular expression of someone walking into a building they had been told they couldn't come back to, adjusting in real time to the fact that they can. She came to Nora's office first before she went to HR, before she found her locker assignment, before she did anything else. She stood in the doorway. "You look different," she said. "I have an office," Nora said. "That's not what I mean." Nora looked at her. "I know." Maya came in and sat down. She looked around the office, at the desk, at the window, at the absence of a mop cart in any corner of the room. And then she looked at Nora with the expression of someone who has something to say and is deciding how to say it without it coming out as more than it is. "I kept those folders for 14 months, she said. "I kept them because I didn't have anywhere else to put what I knew. There was nowhere to take it that would actually land. I know. You were that place. For me." She paused. "I want you to know I understand that's not a small thing to have been." Nora looked at her steadily. "Neither was keeping the folders." Maya almost smiled. "No, it wasn't." "Welcome back," Nora said. The collaboration with Colonel Moss developed over the following months in the incremental, often frustrating way of interinstitutional work between civilian and military systems that had been built without reference to each other and were now being asked to interface. Nora flew to Washington twice, participated in 4 video conferences, submitted 2 written frameworks for civilian-military trauma credentialing standards, and had one significant argument with a DoD administrator who believed that her recommendations were operationally impractical and who was, she determined after 2 weeks of back and forth, both partly right and significantly wrong in ways that mattered. She told him that directly. He appreciated it more than she expected him to, which told her something about the environment she was moving into. She was not recalled to active duty. That door stayed closed, and she did not try to open it. What she built instead was something she didn't have a clean name for at first. A position that lived at the intersection of civilian clinical practice and military operational medicine, that drew on both without being fully defined by either. It was, she eventually understood, exactly the kind of position that the gap she had been inhabiting for 3 years had been shaped to hold if she had been willing to stand in it. She had not been willing. Now she was. 6 months after the hearing, Carver Peak hired a new surgical resident. Her name was Dr. Priya Voss. No relation to the hospital attorney, the coincidence of surname being the kind of unremarkable thing that only stands out when you notice it. And she was 29 and nervous in the specific way of people who are competent but not yet certain their competence is visible to anyone but themselves. She had done her preliminary rotation in emergency medicine at a hospital in Portland and had come to Harlan on a placement that had been arranged through a new program oversight structure, one that Farr's office had helped design and that Kellum had implemented with the particular urgency of a man who understood what happened when oversight was absent. Nora met her on her first day. Not ceremonially, she was not interested in ceremony, and ceremony was not the point. She met her in the trauma bay corridor where Voss was reviewing a patient chart with the slightly hunched posture of someone trying to take up less space than they occupied, and Nora stopped beside her and looked at the chart with her. "The potassium level," Nora said, "flagged 40 minutes ago by the floor nurse." Voss looked at it. "I saw it. I was going to review it after morning rounds." "After morning rounds," Nora said, not as a reprimand, as a question. Voss looked at her, then looked at the chart. "Is the nurse who flagged it available to talk through what she observed?" "She's on the floor." "Okay." Voss closed the chart. "I'll go talk to her now." Nora watched her walk toward the floor, toward the nurse who had flagged the abnormal value, toward the conversation that should have happened 40 minutes ago and was going to happen now, because a resident had understood, in the space of a 10-second exchange, that the chart and the person who made the chart weren't the same source of information and shouldn't be treated as such. It was a small thing. It was the entire thing. Derek found Nora at the nurse's station at the end of that shift, the way he often did. Not waiting for her, just present in the way that people who know each other well become present in each other's orbits without coordination. "How was the first day?" he asked. "Good." She signed the last chart. "How was yours?" "Unremarkable." "Which I now understand to be a good thing." She looked at him. 3 years of her life had passed in the accumulation of unremarkable days, during which she had been making herself small in ways that felt like caution, and were actually, she understood now, a form of fear so practiced it had started to look like a personality. She had told herself she was being prudent. She had been hiding, not from the hospital, not from Mercer or Graves or any of it. From the moment in 2019 that she had replayed so many times, it had worn grooves in her thinking. The 40 seconds between the decision and the outcome. The soldier she had made the only call available and lost anyway. The review that had cleared her and the interior verdict that hadn't. She had carried that verdict like a sentence and served it in Montana in the form of a mop cart and a restricted badge and 11 weeks of being talked around in rooms she should have been running. She had thought that smallness was penance. She had thought making herself invisible was the appropriate cost of having been the person who made a call that didn't save everyone. But the thing about that logic, and she had arrived at this slowly through the specific pedagogy of being forced back into herself, was that the people who needed her weren't helped by her punishment. They weren't safer because she was smaller. The soldier she had lost was not honored by her withdrawal. What honored him, what honored any of it, was doing the work with everything she had, in every situation that asked for it, for as long as she was able. That was all. It was not complicated, it was just hard. "Go home," she told Derek. "You too," he said. She finished the chart. She collected her jacket. She turned off the office light. She walked out through the main entrance of Carver Peak Medical Center into the Montana evening, which was doing what it always did at this hour, going wide and gold and cold at the edges, the sky holding its particular immensity over the landscape with the indifference that large skies have toward the small dramas occurring beneath them. She stood outside for a moment. She was tired in a way that was different from the exhaustion of the 11 weeks. That tiredness had been the tiredness of sustained diminishment, the fatigue of a person spending more energy on not reacting than on acting. This tiredness was the honest exhaustion of a full day's work done at the level she was actually capable of doing it. It was the better kind. She thought about Rosalie Tran's father and his tomatoes. She thought about Maya driving 40 minutes each way for 8 months. She thought about 6 nurses and 11 nurses, and a registry of women who had documented what they saw and been managed out of the rooms where they had seen it, and who had spent months and years waiting for someone to take what they knew seriously. She thought about the thing she had almost let herself believe, that the appropriate response to having made a hard call and lived with the weight of it was to stop making calls, that the cost of being the person who acted was too high to keep paying, that the right answer to the 40 seconds in 2019 was the 11 weeks in Montana. It wasn't. The right answer was this: the office and the chart, and the new resident walking toward the floor nurse, and the letters going out to the women who had been pushed out in the public record in Helena that said, in the careful formal language of institutional accountability, that the wrong things had been wrong and the right things had been right. The right answer was staying, not because it was comfortable, not because it was finished, not because the system had been repaired. It hadn't, not fully, and it probably wouldn't be, not in her lifetime, not in any lifetime, because systems are made of people, and people are the thing that requires constant, unglamorous, repetitive attention to keep from drifting toward the gravity of their worst tendencies. But because she was the person who could see it, and seeing it, and doing nothing with what you saw, was its own kind of harm. Quieter than Graves's, less visible than Briggs's, but harm nonetheless. She had learned that from a mop bucket in a corridor in a Montana hospital at the age of 38, which was later than she would have chosen and earlier than it could have been. And she was going to spend whatever professional time she had left making sure that the next woman who walked into an institution with something to offer didn't have to learn it the same way. Not because the system would be perfect, it wouldn't, but because one person, paying attention, writing it down, refusing to be moved from what they knew, one person doing that was worth more than any protocol written in a conference room by people who had never been asked to hold a mop. She knew that now. She had known it before, in the compressed and irreversible way of things learned under fire. Now she knew it in the sustainable way, the way that fit inside an ordinary life, the way that showed up at 7:15 in a hospital corridor and looked at a chart with a new resident and asked one question and waited for the right answer and then let the right answer be enough. She walked to her car. She drove home through the Harlan evening, past the hardware store with the apartment above it that she still lived in and that had started, incrementally, to feel like a place rather than a location. Inside, she made dinner. She sat at the kitchen table. She looked at the legal pad that was still there from weeks ago, still bearing the circled number, 11:04 a.m., the backup timestamp, the detail that had begun everything. And she tore the page off and threw it away, because that number had done what it needed to do and didn't need to be kept anymore. Then she picked up her phone and called her mother, who lived in Oregon and who had been asking for 3 weeks when Nora was going to have time to visit. And she said, "I'm coming in October. I can stay for 4 days." Her mother said something that made her almost laugh, which was the closest she had come to laughing in longer than she could pinpoint precisely. She sat at the table for another 20 minutes after the call, in the quiet of an apartment that was hers, in a city that had not wanted her until it needed her, and had needed her in ways it didn't fully understand until she was done proving it. The woman who had been handed a mop now had an office. The woman whose complaint had been filed was the woman whose conduct had been formally and publicly found to be sound. The woman who had spent 3 years making herself smaller than she was had stopped. Not because the world had changed. The world changed slowly and imperfectly, and required constant pressure to move at all. But because she had changed, not into something new, not into a different version of herself with the edges sanded down or the hard parts resolved. She had changed in the direction of herself, toward the full, inconvenient, complicated, capable person she had been before she started trying to be a more manageable one. She was not finished. She would not be finished. But she was here, in the specific and irreplaceable way of someone who had decided to stay. Not because the staying was easy, but because the alternative was a smaller life, and she had tried the smaller life, and it had not fit, and she was done pretending it had. Some women were never invisible. They were just waiting for the room to catch up.